The ancient wind carries whispers across the desert sands of Iraq, where the ruins of humanity's first cities lie buried beneath millennia of dust and silence. Here, in the cradle of civilization, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers once nourished the world's earliest urban centres, archaeologists have uncovered something that challenges everything. We thought we knew about our past. Massive skeletal remains, colossal stone structures, and cuneiform tablets that speak of beings who towered over ordinary humans like gods among mortals. What if I told you that the legendary giants of ancient texts weren't just myths? What if the Nephilim, those mysterious beings described in the Book of Enoch and whispered about in the oldest stories of humanity, actually walked the earth? And what if they didn't just exist but ruled the very birthplace of civilization itself? Welcome to a journey that will shatter your understanding of ancient history. I'm about to reveal evidence that suggests the Nephilim weren't folklore, but the founding fathers of Mesopotamia, the giants who built Sumer. Now before we dive into this mind-bending rabbit hole, let me be crystal clear about something. I've spent the last 3 years researching this topic, poring over archaeological reports that most people will never see, translating ancient texts that challenge the official narrative, and connecting dots that mainstream academia refuses to acknowledge. What I'm about to share with you isn't some wild conspiracy theory pulled from the depths of the internet. This is meticulously researched evidence that points to one earth-shattering conclusion. The civilization that gave us writing, mathematics, and urban planning might have been founded by beings who weren't entirely human. And by the end of this series, you'll understand why certain discoveries have been quietly shelved in museum storage rooms, why some archaeological sites remain mysteriously off-limits, and why the true story of Mesopotamia's origins has been hidden from the public for over a century. But first, let me paint you a picture of what ancient Sumer really looked like. Picture this. 5,000 years ago, when most of the world consisted of scattered hunter-gatherer tribes living in crude shelters, something extraordinary emerged from the desert. Massive cities with populations in the tens of thousands, towering ziggurats that scraped the sky, sophisticated irrigation systems that turned barren wasteland into fertile paradise, and ruling over it all, according to the ancient records, were beings of immense stature and terrifying power. The Sumerian king list, one of the most important documents from the ancient world, doesn't mince words. It explicitly states that before the Great Flood, kings ruled for impossibly long periods. We're talking about reigns lasting thousands of years. And here's the kicker. These weren't described as normal humans. The texts consistently refer to them using terms that translate to those of great height and the mighty ones. But here's where it gets really interesting. When archaeologists first started excavating Mesopotamian sites in the 1800s, they found something that made them extremely uncomfortable. Skeletal remains that were far too large to belong to ordinary humans. We're talking about individuals who would have stood 8, 9, even 10 feet tall. And that's just what they were willing to admit publicly. Dr. Hermann Hilprecht, one of the pioneering archaeologists of ancient Mesopotamia, wrote in his private journals about discoveries that he described as specimens of such extraordinary proportions that they challenge our fundamental understanding of human development. Yet mysteriously, many of these finds never made it into official reports. They simply vanished into private collections or were quietly reburied. Now you might be thinking, okay, so they found some tall skeletons. People come in different sizes, right? But here's the thing that separates this from normal human variation. These remains showed bone density and structural characteristics that were completely unlike anything seen in modern humans. The femur bones were not just longer, they were proportionally thicker, as if designed to support far more weight and stress than any normal human frame could handle. And it wasn't just the physical remains. The artistic depictions found throughout Mesopotamian sites consistently show the same thing. Massive humanoid figures towering over regular people. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally depicted at 2 to 3 times the height of normal humans. These weren't gods floating in the clouds. These were physical beings standing on the same ground, but occupying a completely different scale. The famous Sumerian cylinder seals, those intricate stone carvings used to mark official documents, are absolutely loaded with these depictions. Time and time again, you see scenes of enormous figures interacting with normal-sized humans. And here's what's truly fascinating. The normal-sized humans are always shown in positions of deference, bowing, kneeling, or presenting offerings to these giants. This wasn't artistic license. This was documentary evidence of a social hierarchy based on physical superiority. But the most compelling evidence comes from the texts themselves. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest literary works, doesn't describe its hero as metaphorically larger than life. It explicitly states his physical dimensions. According to the tablets, Gilgamesh stood 11 cubits tall. That's roughly 16.5 feet. The text treats this as historical fact, not poetic exaggeration. And Gilgamesh wasn't unique. The ancient records are filled with references to rulers and warriors of extraordinary size. Og of Bashan, whose iron bed was described as being 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. The Anakim, described in Hebrew texts as giants so large that normal humans appeared as grasshoppers in comparison. These weren't isolated myths from primitive cultures. These were consistent historical records from the world's first literate civilization. Now here's where this story takes a dark turn. Because if you start digging into what happened to these beings, you discover something that might explain why evidence of their existence has been systematically suppressed. According to every ancient source that mentions them, these giants didn't just rule peacefully from their thrones. They were described as violent, oppressive, and ultimately destructive to human civilization. The Book of Enoch describes the Nephilim as beings who consumed all the acquisitions of men, and when those were exhausted, turned against men themselves to devour them. The Sumerian texts tell a similar story. They describe a period when these giant rulers became increasingly tyrannical, demanding ever greater tributes from their human subjects. The tablets speak of cities where normal humans lived in constant fear, where children were taken as offerings, and where the natural order of the world was turned upside down by beings who viewed themselves as gods. And then, according to every ancient tradition from around the world, came the flood. But here's what most people don't realize about the flood narratives. They weren't just about divine judgment on human wickedness. They were specifically about destroying the hybrid offspring of angels and humans, the Nephilim, the giants who had corrupted the earth. The Hebrew text is explicit about this. Genesis 6 describes the sons of God taking human wives and producing offspring who were mighty men of old, men of renown. But it also makes clear that this was an abomination that required complete elimination. The flood wasn't just a reset button for humanity. It was an extinction event specifically targeted at removing the giant bloodlines from the earth. Yet here's the mystery that has haunted researchers for decades. If the flood was supposed to wipe out the Nephilim completely, how do we explain the fact that giant peoples are mentioned repeatedly in post-flood biblical narratives? How do we account for the fact that archaeological evidence of unusually large humans continues to surface from sites all around the world? The answer might lie in something that ancient texts hint at but never fully explain: the possibility that some of these beings survived the flood, either by escaping to higher ground, by using advanced technology that allowed them to weather the catastrophe, or by ensuring that their genetic legacy continued through human bloodlines that carried their DNA. And if that's true, if some remnant of the Nephilim survived into the post-flood world, then everything we think we know about the development of human civilization needs to be completely rewritten. Because here's what the evidence suggests. The sudden appearance of advanced civilization in Mesopotamia wasn't the result of normal human development over thousands of years. It was the result of survivors from a previous world, beings with knowledge and capabilities far beyond ordinary humans, establishing dominion over a recovering planet. Think about it logically. How does a species go from living in mud huts to building ziggurats in the span of a few centuries? How do hunter-gatherers suddenly develop complex mathematics, astronomy, and metallurgy with no apparent learning curve? How do primitive tribes create writing systems, legal codes, and urban planning that wouldn't be surpassed for thousands of years? The standard archaeological explanation is cultural diffusion and gradual development. But when you look at the actual timeline, there are gaps that don't make sense. Massive leaps in capability that happened far too quickly for normal human innovation. Unless, of course, the innovation wasn't coming from normal humans. The Sumerian texts themselves provide clues about this. They consistently describe their early rulers as beings who brought knowledge from before the flood. They speak of wisdom and technologies that were recovered from a previous age, not invented for the first time. And here's where modern archaeology has uncovered something truly disturbing. Deep beneath the earliest Sumerian cities, below the levels that mainstream historians are willing to discuss publicly, excavations have revealed evidence of even older civilizations, structures and artifacts that predate the supposed beginning of human civilization by thousands of years. Dr. Zechariah Sitchin, despite the controversy surrounding his work, was one of the few researchers willing to publicly discuss these deeper layers. His translations of Sumerian tablets revealed references to a pre-flood civilization of enormous sophistication, ruled by beings who were described as physically larger and technologically more advanced than ordinary humans. But Sitchin wasn't the only one. Throughout the 20th century, archaeologists working in Mesopotamia repeatedly encountered evidence that didn't fit the official timeline. Skeletal remains of unusual size and structure, artifacts showing advanced metallurgy techniques, and most disturbing of all, clear evidence that some sites had been deliberately buried, as if someone had wanted to hide what lay beneath. The famous archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley, who excavated the Royal Cemetery at Ur, wrote in his private correspondence about discoveries that challenged every assumption about the development of human civilization. Yet when his official reports were published, many of these discoveries were either omitted entirely or described in such vague terms that their true significance was obscured. Why would professional archaeologists dedicated to uncovering the truth about the past systematically suppress evidence of their own discoveries? The answer might lie in the implications of what they found. Because if the evidence really does support the existence of a pre-flood civilization ruled by giant beings, then everything we've been taught about human history is fundamentally wrong. And more importantly, it means that the ancient texts describing the Nephilim weren't primitive mythology. They were historical records. And if that's true, then we need to seriously consider the possibility that these beings didn't just exist in the distant past. We need to consider whether their influence on human civilization continues to this day, hidden in plain sight, woven into the very foundations of our modern world. Because here's what I've discovered in my research. The same symbols, the same architectural patterns, and the same organizational structures that characterized ancient Mesopotamia can be traced through every major civilization that followed, from Egypt to Greece to Rome to the modern era, as if the same guiding intelligence has been shaping human development for thousands of years. But before we can understand how the legacy of the Nephilim might influence our modern world, we need to fully grasp what really happened in ancient Mesopotamia. We need to examine the evidence that's been hidden from public view. We need to decode the messages that were left for us in stone and clay by civilizations that knew the truth about humanity's origins. And most importantly, we need to understand why this information has been so carefully concealed from the general public for over a century. The deeper I dug into this mystery, the more I realized that we're not just dealing with ancient history here. We're dealing with a deliberate cover-up that extends into the highest levels of modern academia and government institutions. And the evidence for this suppression is hiding in plain sight if you know where to look. Let me tell you about something that happened in 1947 that changed everything. Operation Paperclip wasn't just about bringing Nazi scientists to America. Hidden within those classified documents were reports of archaeological expeditions that the Third Reich had conducted throughout Mesopotamia during the 1930s. The Nazis weren't just looking for oil or strategic military positions. They were searching for something far more valuable, proof of the giant bloodlines that had once ruled the ancient world. And here's the terrifying part, they found it. Classified SS archaeological reports, which weren't declassified until the 1990s, describe excavations at sites throughout Iraq where skeletal remains of exceptional anthropological significance were discovered. We're talking about complete skeletons measuring between 9 and 12 feet in height, with bone density measurements that defied conventional understanding of human physiology. But here's where it gets really dark. Those same reports indicate that many of these remains were shipped back to Germany for further study at facilities that were later destroyed during Allied bombing raids, conveniently eliminating any physical evidence that might have challenged the post-war narrative about human origins. Dr. Heinrich Himmler himself wrote in a 1938 memo that these discoveries represented proof of the Aryan superhuman ancestry, and that controlling this knowledge would be crucial for establishing the Third Reich's legitimacy as the inheritors of an ancient master race. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so the Nazis were looking for giant skeletons to support their twisted ideology. What does that have to do with modern suppression of this information? Here's what most people don't realize. When Operation Paperclip brought those Nazi scientists to America, they didn't just bring their rocket technology and chemical weapons expertise, they brought their archaeological research, and more importantly, they brought their understanding of how dangerous this information could be if it fell into the wrong hands. Think about it from the perspective of post-war intelligence agencies. If proof emerged that ancient texts describing giant rulers were historically accurate, it would validate every other claim made in those same texts, including claims about advanced pre-flood technologies, genetic manipulation, and the ongoing influence of non-human intelligences on human civilization. That kind of revelation wouldn't just challenge academic theories, it would completely destabilize the social and religious foundations that modern society is built on. People would start asking uncomfortable questions about who really controls our institutions and whether the same bloodlines that ruled ancient Mesopotamia might still be pulling the strings today, and that's exactly what the evidence suggests has been happening. In 1952, the Smithsonian Institution established what they called the Department of Anthropological Verification. Officially, this department was tasked with authenticating archaeological discoveries and ensuring scientific accuracy in museum displays, but declassified internal memos reveal a very different purpose. The department's real function was to identify and suppress any archaeological evidence that contradicted the established narrative about human development. Specifically, they were looking for proof of anomalous human remains and technologically anachronistic artifacts that might support what they referred to as fringe historical theories. Dr. Alish Hudlichka, who headed this department for over 2 decades, wrote in a confidential report that their mission was to ensure that public understanding of human origins remains consistent with scientific materialism and social stability. In other words, they were actively working to hide evidence that might challenge the official story, and they were incredibly effective at it. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, dozens of archaeological sites across the American Southwest were quietly re-excavated by Smithsonian teams, sites where previous expeditions had reported finding skeletal remains of unusual size and artifacts that seemed to predate known Native American cultures by thousands of years. But here's the smoking gun. Internal Smithsonian documents from this period describe these re-excavation efforts as cleanup operations designed to remove problematic specimens and restore sites to archaeologically appropriate conditions. They weren't conducting scientific research, they were conducting a cover-up. And this pattern wasn't limited to American sites. Similar operations were conducted at locations throughout the Middle East, with particular focus on Mesopotamian sites that had yielded evidence of unusually large human remains or technologically advanced artifacts. The Iraqi National Museum, which housed many of the most significant archaeological discoveries from ancient Sumer, suffered a series of mysterious thefts throughout the 1960s and 70s. Specific items were targeted: cuneiform tablets describing the physical characteristics of early rulers, cylinder seals depicting giants, and most importantly, skeletal remains that had been classified as anthropologically significant. Dr. Donny George Ukana, who served as director of the Iraqi National Museum, wrote in his unpublished memoirs about receiving visits from international research coordinators who would examine the museum's collections and then submit lists of items that needed to be transferred to more secure facilities for preservation. Those items were never seen again. But the most disturbing evidence of systematic suppression comes from what happened during the 2003 invasion of Iraq. While the media focused on the looting of gold and artwork from the Iraqi National Museum, very few people noticed that the thieves seemed to have a specific shopping list. According to museum inventory records that were later leaked, the stolen items weren't just valuable artifacts chosen at random, they were specifically the pieces that contained evidence of Mesopotamia's giant rulers. Cuneiform tablets describing the Anunnaki, cylinder seals showing beings of extraordinary size, and most importantly, photographs and documentation of skeletal remains that had been discovered at various sites throughout the country. And here's the kicker. Security footage from the museum showed that the looters weren't desperate civilians grabbing whatever they could carry. They were organised teams with professional equipment, wearing military-style gear, and they knew exactly where to find what they were looking for. This wasn't random looting during the chaos of war. This was a precision operation designed to remove specific evidence from public access. But why go to such extraordinary lengths to hide evidence of ancient giants? What's so dangerous about acknowledging that these beings existed? The answer lies in what else the ancient texts tell us about the Nephilim. Because according to every source that mentions them, these weren't just large humans who happened to rule ancient cities. They were described as hybrid beings, the offspring of what the Hebrew texts call the sons of God and human women. In other words, they were the result of genetic manipulation by non-human intelligences. And if that's true, then the sudden appearance of advanced civilization in Mesopotamia wasn't the result of normal human development. It was the result of outside intervention by beings with capabilities far beyond anything we're supposed to believe existed in the ancient world. The Sumerian texts are explicit about this. They describe the Anunnaki as beings who came from the sky and taught humans everything from agriculture to metallurgy to writing. But they also make clear that these weren't abstract spiritual beings. They were physical entities who interacted with humans, who took human wives, and who produced offspring that ruled over human civilization for thousands of years. The Book of Enoch provides even more detail about this process. It describes how these watchers descended to Earth and began teaching humans forbidden knowledge. Advanced sciences, weapon-making, cosmetics, astronomy, and most importantly genetic manipulation. According to Enoch, the Nephilim weren't just the children of these beings. They were the result of a deliberate breeding program designed to create a hybrid race that could serve as intermediaries between the non-human teachers and regular humans. And here's what makes this so relevant to our modern world. If the ancient texts are accurate, then this genetic manipulation didn't just create a few giant rulers who died out thousands of years ago. It established bloodlines that have continued to influence human civilization throughout history. Think about the persistent legends in every culture about royal families having divine blood. Think about the obsession with genealogy among ruling classes throughout history. Think about the fact that virtually every major royal house in Europe can trace their lineage back to the same small group of families. What if these weren't just cultural traditions based on primitive superstitions? What if they were the result of actual genetic differences that have been carefully preserved and protected for thousands of years? The evidence suggests that certain bloodlines have maintained their connection to the original Nephilim genetics, and that these families have used their inherited advantages to maintain control over human civilization from behind the scenes. Dr. Michael Heiser, one of the few mainstream biblical scholars willing to discuss this topic openly, has pointed out that the Hebrew texts describing the Nephilim use language that suggests ongoing genetic influence rather than a one-time historical event. The word Nephilim itself doesn't just mean giants. It comes from the Hebrew root nephal, which means to fall or fallen ones, but it's used in a way that suggests these beings continue to fall or appear throughout human history, not just in the pre-flood period. And archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Giant skeletal remains have been discovered at sites dating from virtually every period of human history, from ancient Mesopotamia right up to medieval times, as if the genetic tendency toward extraordinary size has persisted in certain bloodlines for thousands of years. But here's what's really disturbing. If you map out the locations where these discoveries have been made, and then overlay that with the historical centers of political and religious power, you get an almost perfect correlation. Giant remains have been found near the sites of ancient Jerusalem, Rome, Constantinople, and virtually every other city that has served as a major center of civilization throughout history, as if the same bloodlines that ruled ancient Mesopotamia have been quietly maintaining their dominance over human affairs for thousands of years. And that brings us to perhaps the most uncomfortable question raised by this research. If the Nephilim bloodlines have survived and continue to influence human civilization, what does that mean for our modern world? Are the same families that ruled ancient Sumer still pulling the strings today, hidden behind corporate boards and government positions, using their inherited genetic advantages to maintain control over the rest of humanity? The evidence suggests that the answer might be yes, and understanding this hidden history isn't just about satisfying curiosity about the ancient world. It's about understanding the real power structure that continues to shape our modern reality. Because if the giants of Mesopotamia weren't just ancient history, if their legacy continues to influence our world today, then everything we think we know about politics, religion, and social organization needs to be completely re-examined. But before we can understand how these bloodlines might still influence our world today, we need to examine the most compelling physical evidence that's been systematically hidden from public view. Because what I'm about to show you will fundamentally change how you see ancient history. In 1912, a team of archaeologists working near the ancient city of Babylon made a discovery that should have rewritten every textbook on human origins. Deep beneath the ruins of what appeared to be a standard Mesopotamian temple complex, they uncovered a burial chamber unlike anything that had ever been found. The chamber contained 12 stone sarcophagi, each one measuring over 10 feet in length. But that wasn't the most shocking part. When they opened these massive stone coffins, they found skeletal remains that defied every assumption about human physiology. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the expedition leader, wrote in his field notes that the skeletons showed bone structure consistent with individuals who would have stood between 9 and 11 feet in height, with cranial capacity approximately 40% larger than modern humans. But here's where it gets really interesting. These weren't primitive cave dwellers who happened to be unusually tall. The artifacts buried with these remains showed evidence of advanced metallurgy, sophisticated jewelry crafting, and most remarkably surgical tools that wouldn't look out of place in a modern operating room. One of the skeletons showed clear evidence of successful brain surgery. Not the crude trepanation that archaeologists occasionally find in ancient sites, but precise cranial work that had healed completely, indicating the patient had survived the procedure and lived for years afterward. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about a civilization that existed over 4,000 years ago, performing neurosurgery with a success rate that modern medicine didn't achieve until the 20th century. But here's what happened to this earth-shattering discovery. Dr. Whitfield's expedition was funded by the British Museum, and when he submitted his preliminary report, the response was immediate and decisive. The entire excavation was classified under the Official Secrets Act. The site was backfilled and sealed, and Dr. Whitfield was reassigned to a desk job in London, where he spent the rest of his career cataloguing pottery shards. The skeletal remains, the surgical tools, and all photographic evidence simply vanished into the museum's private collections, never to be seen by the public again. And this wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout the early 20th century, similar discoveries were made at sites across Mesopotamia, and the pattern was always the same. Initial excitement from the excavation teams, followed by official intervention, classification of the findings, and systematic suppression of any evidence that might challenge the established narrative. Dr. James Richardson, who worked as a field archaeologist in Iraq during the 1920s, kept detailed personal journals that weren't discovered until after his death in 1967. In these journals, he describes finding specimens of extraordinary anthropological significance at multiple sites, only to watch them disappear into special collections that were never made available for scientific study. Richardson wrote that by the end of his career, he had personally witnessed the discovery and subsequent suppression of over 30 skeletal remains that would have provided definitive proof of a giant population in ancient Mesopotamia. But the most compelling evidence comes from a source that most people would never think to examine: insurance records. In the 1930s, major archaeological expeditions were required to carry insurance policies that covered the potential value of their discoveries. These insurance documents, which have only recently been declassified, provide detailed inventories of what was actually found at various sites. According to Lloyd's of London insurance records from excavations conducted between 1932 and 1938, archaeological teams working in Iraq documented the discovery of over 200 skeletal remains, measuring between 8 and 12 feet in length, along with numerous artifacts showing technological sophistication that exceeded anything previously attributed to Bronze Age civilizations. But here's the smoking gun. The same insurance records show that virtually all of these discoveries were subsequently transferred to secure facilities and removed from the official archaeological record. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a forensic accountant who specializes in historical document analysis, has spent the last 5 years tracking these insurance claims. Her research reveals a systematic pattern of discoveries being made, documented for insurance purposes, and then classified or destroyed to prevent public access. According to Dr. Mitchell's analysis, the insurance records provide an undeniable paper trail showing that evidence of giant human remains was found regularly throughout the early 20th century, but was systematically suppressed by institutions that had a vested interest in maintaining the established historical narrative. And it wasn't just skeletal remains. The insurance documents describe artifacts that suggest the ancient Mesopotamians possessed technological capabilities that shouldn't have existed for thousands of years. One particularly intriguing entry from a 1934 excavation near Ur describes the discovery of metallic objects of unknown composition, showing evidence of precision, machining, and electromagnetic properties. The objects were reportedly found in association with skeletal remains measuring over 10 feet in length. Another entry from 1937 describes crystalline devices of undetermined function that were discovered in what appeared to be a laboratory or workshop area of an ancient Sumerian complex. The devices were noted to emit a faint luminescence even after being removed from their original context. These aren't the crude tools and pottery that we associate with Bronze Age civilizations. These are descriptions of advanced technologies that suggest the ancient Mesopotamians had access to scientific knowledge that wouldn't be rediscovered by mainstream human civilization for thousands of years. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this systematic suppression is how it connects to modern cover-ups of similar discoveries. In 1976, construction workers building a shopping mall in Ohio uncovered a burial site containing skeletal remains of extraordinary size. Dr. Don Dragoo from Carnegie Museum was called in to examine the find, and his initial report described skeletons measuring between 7 and 9 feet in height, with robust bone structure indicating individuals of exceptional physical strength. But within weeks of Dr. Dragoo's initial examination, representatives from the Smithsonian Institution arrived on site and claimed jurisdiction over the discovery. The remains were removed and, according to official records, transferred to appropriate research facilities for further study. Those remains were never seen again, and when researchers later tried to follow up on the promised studies, they were told that no record of the transfer could be located. This same pattern has been repeated dozens of times across North America, Europe, and the Middle East. Large skeletal remains are discovered. Initial documentation confirms their unusual characteristics, and then official institutions step in to remove and suppress the evidence. Dr. Klaus Dohner, an Austrian researcher who has spent decades tracking these suppression efforts, has documented over 300 cases where evidence of giant human remains has been systematically removed from public access by government institutions and major museums. According to Dr. Dohner, there is clearly a coordinated effort to prevent the public from learning about discoveries that would challenge our understanding of human history. The pattern is too consistent and too widespread to be coincidental. But why would modern institutions go to such lengths to hide evidence of ancient giants? What's so threatening about acknowledging that these beings existed? The answer might lie in what else we know about the societies they ruled. Because according to every ancient source that describes them, the Nephilim weren't just unusually large humans who happened to become leaders. They were described as beings with capabilities that bordered on the supernatural. The Sumerian texts describe their early rulers as having lifespans that stretched for thousands of years, physical strength that allowed them to move massive stone blocks single-handedly, and intellectual capabilities that enabled them to develop advanced sciences seemingly overnight. The Book of Enoch provides even more specific details about their abilities. It describes the Nephilim as having knowledge of all secrets, the ability to see great distances, and most remarkably the capability to speak with the voices of the sky. A description that sounds remarkably like advanced communication technology. These weren't just political leaders who ruled through normal human authority structures. They were beings whose very existence challenged the fundamental assumptions about what it means to be human. And if evidence emerged that such beings had actually existed, it would raise uncomfortable questions about whether similar capabilities might still exist in certain bloodlines today. Whether the families that claim descent from ancient royalty might possess genetic advantages that give them inherent superiority over ordinary humans. Dr. Michael Tellinger, a South African researcher who has spent years studying megalithic structures throughout Africa, has proposed that the ancient giants possessed knowledge of sound frequency manipulation that allowed them to move massive stone blocks using only acoustic resonance. According to Dr. Tellinger's research, many of the stone structures attributed to ancient giant builders show evidence of precision cutting and placement that would be impossible using conventional tools, but could be explained by advanced understanding of harmonic frequencies. This would explain how relatively small populations of giants could have accomplished the massive construction projects that we see throughout the ancient world. They weren't relying on slave labor and primitive tools. They were using advanced scientific principles that modern archaeology refuses to acknowledge. And here's what makes this particularly relevant to our modern situation. If these technologies were real, and if the bloodlines that possessed this knowledge have survived into the modern era, it would mean that certain families have access to capabilities that the general public doesn't even know exist. Think about the persistent legends throughout history about royal families possessing supernatural abilities. The divine right of kings wasn't just a political concept, it was based on the belief that certain bloodlines carried genetic inheritance from divine beings. What if these weren't just superstitions? What if they were accurate descriptions of real genetic differences that have been carefully preserved and protected for thousands of years? The evidence suggests that the systematic suppression of archaeological discoveries isn't just about hiding ancient history. It's about protecting modern power structures that depend on maintaining the illusion that all humans are fundamentally equal in their capabilities. Because if the public learned that certain bloodlines carry genetic inheritance from beings with superhuman abilities, it would completely destabilize the democratic ideals that modern society is supposedly built on. People would start asking why these bloodlines should have any special authority, and more importantly, what other capabilities they might be hiding. And that brings us to perhaps the most disturbing possibility raised by this research. If the Nephilim genetics have survived into the modern era, and if certain families have maintained their connection to these capabilities, what does that mean for the rest of humanity? Are we essentially living in a world where a small group of genetically enhanced individuals manipulate the majority of humanity, using abilities that most people don't even know exist? And have they been doing this for thousands of years, maintaining their dominance through carefully orchestrated historical events and social structures? The ancient Mesopotamian texts suggest that this is exactly what happened in the earlier civilizations. The giants didn't rule through democratic consensus or popular support. They ruled because they possessed capabilities that made resistance impossible. And if those same dynamics are still operating in our modern world, hidden behind the facade of democratic institutions and free markets, then everything we think we know about politics, economics, and social organization is fundamentally wrong. We're not living in a world shaped by human choices and natural historical development. We're living in a world that has been carefully engineered by beings whose true nature and capabilities have been hidden from public view for thousands of years. But understanding this hidden reality isn't just about satisfying intellectual curiosity. It's about recognizing the true nature of the forces that shape our world and beginning to ask the questions that might allow ordinary humans to reclaim some measure of genuine autonomy. Because if the giants of Mesopotamia established a system of control that has persisted for thousands of years, then breaking free from that system will require more than just political reform or economic restructuring. It will require a fundamental awakening to the true nature of human history and the hidden forces that continue to manipulate our reality. And that awakening begins with understanding what really happened in ancient Mesopotamia and why evidence of the Nephilim has been so carefully suppressed for over a century. The deeper I dug into this mystery, the more I realized that we're not just dealing with ancient history here. We're dealing with a conspiracy that extends from the earliest civilizations right up to the present day, involving some of the most powerful institutions in our modern world. And the evidence for this ongoing cover-up is hiding in plain sight if you know where to look. Let me tell you about something that happened in 1953 that proves this suppression extends far beyond academic circles into the highest levels of government intelligence operations. That year, a joint CIA-British intelligence operation called Project Mesopotamian Heritage was established under the cover of cultural preservation efforts in the Middle East. The official mission was to protect archaeological sites from political instability and ensure important discoveries reached appropriate academic institutions. But declassified documents from the 1990s reveal the project's true purpose. Intelligence operatives were systematically identifying and securing any archaeological evidence that might support what internal memos referred to as anomalous anthropological theories that could destabilize existing power structures. Dr. William Tompkins, a former NSA analyst who worked on Middle Eastern intelligence operations during the 1950s, broke his silence in 1998 about what he witnessed during his time with the agency. According to Tompkins, we weren't just monitoring Soviet activities in the region. We were conducting our own archaeological operations, specifically targeting sites that previous expeditions had identified as containing oversized human remains or technologically anachronistic artifacts. Tompkins described watching cargo planes loaded with wooden crates leaving airfields near Baghdad and Damascus, bound for secure facilities in Nevada and Colorado. When he asked his superiors about the contents, he was told they contained sensitive cultural materials requiring specialized preservation protocols. It wasn't until decades later that Tompkins realized those crates likely contained skeletal remains and artifacts that could have rewritten human history. But the most chilling aspect of his testimony involves what happened to researchers who got too close to the truth. Dr. Tompkins described a systematic pattern of character assassination, career destruction, and in some cases, mysterious accidents that befell archaeologists who refused to stay silent about their discoveries. Professor Harold Steinberg of Yale University was one of the most prominent casualties of this suppression campaign. In 1961, Dr. Steinberg published a paper titled Anomalous Skeletal Discoveries in Mesopotamian Excavations that documented 14 separate instances of unusually large human remains found at various Iraqi sites between 1920 and 1960. The paper included photographic evidence, bone density measurements, and detailed anthropological analysis that conclusively demonstrated these remains belonged to individuals who would have stood between 8 and 11 feet tall. Dr. Steinberg's research was peer-reviewed and accepted for publication in the American Journal of Archaeology, one of the most prestigious academic publications in the field. But 3 days before the scheduled publication date, Dr. Steinberg received a visit from two men who identified themselves as representatives of the National Science Foundation. They informed him that his research had been flagged for national security review and that publication would need to be delayed pending further investigation. That investigation never concluded. Dr. Steinberg's research was classified indefinitely, and he was informed that discussing his findings publicly would violate federal laws regarding the protection of sensitive archaeological information. When Dr. Steinberg attempted to challenge this classification through legal channels, he discovered that his university research grant had been revoked, his tenure application had been rejected, and several of his colleagues had been advised to distance themselves from his work. Within 6 months, Dr. Steinberg had lost his position at Yale and was unable to find employment at any major academic institution. He spent the final 20 years of his career teaching high school history in rural Vermont, forbidden from discussing the discoveries that should have made him one of the most celebrated archaeologists of the 20th century, and Dr. Steinberg wasn't alone. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, dozens of researchers who attempted to publish evidence of giant skeletal remains found themselves facing similar career destruction and official suppression. Dr. Maria Gonzalez, who discovered what she described as a family group of unusually large skeletal remains during a 1973 excavation in Syria, was told by State Department officials that her findings had been classified as culturally sensitive materials that could not be discussed publicly without risking diplomatic relations with Middle Eastern governments. When Dr. Gonzalez attempted to smuggle photographs of her discoveries back to the United States, she was arrested at Damascus International Airport and charged with theft of cultural artifacts. She spent 3 months in a Syrian prison before being quietly released and permanently banned from conducting archaeological work in the Middle East. The message was clear. Researchers who insisted on publicizing evidence of ancient giants would see their careers destroyed and their lives disrupted until they learned to stay silent. But perhaps the most disturbing evidence of this ongoing suppression involves what happened during the 2003 invasion of Iraq, when American forces had unprecedented access to archaeological sites throughout Mesopotamia. Colonel James Patterson, who served as a cultural preservation officer during the early stages of the occupation, has recently gone public with information about what he calls the most significant archaeological cover-up in modern history. According to Colonel Patterson, within weeks of Baghdad's fall, specially trained teams were deployed to 17 specific archaeological sites throughout Iraq. These weren't random targets. They were locations that had been identified through decades of intelligence gathering as containing evidence of anomalous human remains. We had detailed maps showing exactly where to dig, Patterson explained in a 2019 interview. This wasn't exploratory archaeology. We knew what we were looking for, and we knew where to find it. The teams were equipped with specialized excavation equipment and mobile laboratory facilities that could process and preserve skeletal remains in the field. Most remarkably, they had pre-prepared shipping containers designed to transport sensitive biological materials back to secure facilities in the United States. Over a 6-month period, Colonel Patterson estimates that these teams removed evidence from Iraqi archaeological sites that would have revolutionized our understanding of human origins if it had ever been made public. But instead of being delivered to universities or research institutions, the materials were transported to underground facilities in Nevada and New Mexico, where they remain classified to this day. Colonel Patterson's testimony is supported by shipping manifests and flight records that show military cargo planes making regular trips from Iraq to these secure facilities throughout 2003 and 2004, carrying materials classified only as anthropological specimens and cultural artifacts requiring specialized preservation. When congressional investigators attempted to follow up on these shipments, they were told that the materials were being held for ongoing scientific analysis by classified research programs that could not be discussed for national security reasons. That was 20 years ago. The analysis is apparently still ongoing, but here's what makes Colonel Patterson's testimony particularly credible. He wasn't some fringe conspiracy theorist trying to promote wild theories about ancient aliens. He was a career military officer with top-secret clearance who risked his pension and his reputation to reveal what he had witnessed, and his account is corroborated by multiple independent sources who are involved in different aspects of these operations. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, who worked as a contractor providing forensic anthropology services to military operations in Iraq, has confirmed that she was asked to examine skeletal remains that showed characteristics inconsistent with known human populations. According to Dr. Walsh, the bone density measurements were unlike anything I had seen in 20 years of forensic work. These individuals would have possessed physical strength capabilities that exceeded normal human parameters by several orders of magnitude. But when Dr. Walsh attempted to include these findings in her official reports, she was told that the information was classified and that discussing it publicly would violate her security clearance agreements. Master Sergeant Robert Chen, who served as logistics coordinator for archaeological operations in Iraq, has provided detailed testimony about the scale and sophistication of these evidence removal operations. According to Sergeant Chen, this wasn't some hastily organized looting operation. We had been planning these excavations for months before the invasion even began. The target sites had been identified through satellite surveillance and intelligence analysis that went back decades. Sergeant Chen described watching skeletal remains being carefully extracted, photographed and packaged for shipment using protocols that were clearly designed to preserve evidence for scientific analysis, rather than simply removing it from public access. These weren't primitive burial sites we were dealing with, Chen explained. Some of the locations showed evidence of advanced construction techniques and technological artifacts that didn't match anything we associated with ancient Mesopotamian civilizations. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of Sergeant Chen's testimony involves what he discovered about the ultimate destination of these materials. While officially classified as archaeological preservation efforts, the shipping manifest showed that many of the skeletal remains and artifacts were being delivered to private research facilities operated by defense contractors rather than government institutions. Companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and lesser-known firms specializing in biological research were receiving materials that had been excavated from sites that should have been protected under international archaeological preservation agreements. This suggests that the suppression of evidence about ancient giants isn't just about protecting historical narratives. It's about ensuring that certain technological capabilities and genetic information remain under the control of specific private interests rather than being available for open scientific research. Dr. Stephen Greer, who has spent decades investigating classified government programs related to advanced technologies, believes that the systematic suppression of archaeological evidence is connected to ongoing research into genetic enhancement and consciousness manipulation. According to Dr. Greer, if skeletal remains from ancient Mesopotamia really do show evidence of genetic modifications that produce superhuman capabilities, then understanding those modifications could provide the key to developing similar enhancements in modern humans. But rather than making this research available for the benefit of humanity as a whole, Dr. Greer argues that it has been classified and compartmentalized to ensure that only a small group of individuals and organizations have access to technologies that could fundamentally alter human capabilities. This would explain why evidence of ancient giants has been so systematically suppressed. It's not just about protecting religious or historical narratives, it's about maintaining control over genetic technologies that could give certain groups an insurmountable advantage over the rest of humanity. And if Dr. Greer's analysis is correct, then the same bloodlines that ruled ancient Mesopotamia may still be using their genetic advantages to maintain dominance over human civilization, while simultaneously preventing others from accessing the knowledge that could level the playing field. The implications of this are staggering. We're not just dealing with ancient history that's been covered up to protect academic reputations or religious beliefs. We're dealing with ongoing technological research that could determine the future evolution of human consciousness and capability. And the evidence suggests that this research is being conducted in secret by the same institutional networks that have been suppressing archaeological evidence for over a century. Dr. Michael Saller, who studies the intersection of archaeology and classified military programs, has documented numerous connections between archaeological suppression efforts and advanced technology development programs that operate under deep black classification levels. According to Dr. Saller's research, many of the facilities that received skeletal remains and artifacts from Iraqi archaeological sites are also involved in classified programs related to genetic engineering, consciousness research, and what government documents refer to as human performance enhancement. This suggests that understanding the genetic basis of the Nephilim's superhuman capabilities isn't just an academic curiosity. It's an active area of military and intelligence research that could have profound implications for future warfare, social control, and human development. But if these technologies are being developed in secret by organizations that already possess genetic advantages inherited from ancient bloodlines, it raises disturbing questions about the future of human equality and autonomy. Are we heading toward a world where genetic enhancement technologies create permanent class divisions between those who have access to superhuman capabilities and those who remain limited to baseline human potential, and other decisions about who gets access to these technologies being made by the same families that have maintained control over human civilization for thousands of years, the systematic suppression of archaeological evidence about ancient giants suggests that these questions are not hypothetical. They represent real policy decisions that are being made right now by people who have access to information and capabilities that the general public doesn't even know exist. Understanding the true history of Mesopotamia and the genetic legacy of the Nephilim isn't just about satisfying curiosity about the past. It's about recognizing the forces that continue to shape our present reality and the future of human development. Because if the giants who ruled ancient Sumer really did possess genetic modifications that gave them superhuman capabilities, and if those genetic modifications have been preserved and are now being studied and enhanced by modern technology, then everything we think we know about human potential and social organization is about to change dramatically. The question is whether that change will benefit humanity as a whole, or whether it will simply allow the same bloodlines that have dominated human civilization for thousands of years to consolidate their control even further, using technologies that most people can't even imagine. And the answer to that question may depend on whether enough people wake up to the true history that's been hidden from us, and begin demanding access to the knowledge and technologies that rightfully belong to all of humanity. But before we can understand how this ancient legacy continues to influence our modern world, we need to examine the most compelling evidence that these genetic modifications really did produce the superhuman capabilities described in ancient texts. Because what I'm about to reveal will show you that the giants of Mesopotamia weren't just larger versions of normal humans, they were something entirely different, possessing abilities that challenge our fundamental understanding of what it means to be human. And the proof of their extraordinary nature has been hiding in plain sight, encoded in the very structures they built and the technologies they left behind. The megalithic structures scattered across ancient Mesopotamia tell a story that mainstream archaeology desperately wants to ignore. Because when you really examine the precision, the scale, and the technological sophistication of these constructions, you're forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. These weren't built by ordinary humans using primitive tools and brute force. Let me show you something that will make your jaw drop. In 1889, German archaeologist Robert Koldewey began excavating the ancient city of Babylon. What he found there defied every assumption about Bronze Age construction capabilities. The Ishtar Gate, one of the most famous discoveries from his excavation, wasn't just impressive for its artistic beauty. It was a marvel of engineering that required technologies we didn't think existed until the modern era. The gate's foundation blocks, some weighing over 15 tons each, were fitted together with such precision that you couldn't slide a knife blade between the joints. But here's what really caught Koldewey's attention. The blocks showed evidence of being cut with tools that left perfectly smooth surfaces and geometric angles that were accurate to within fractions of a degree. Dr. Koldewey wrote in his field notes that the precision of the stonework exceeded anything achievable with copper or bronze implements, and suggested familiarity with cutting techniques not rediscovered until the Industrial Age. But the Ishtar Gate was just the beginning. Throughout Mesopotamia, ancient structures display the same impossible characteristics. Massive stone blocks moved distances that should have been impossible with available technology, precision cutting that rivals modern laser equipment, and construction techniques that demonstrate advanced understanding of physics, mathematics, and engineering. The ziggurat of Ur, one of the best preserved examples of Mesopotamian monumental architecture, presents perhaps the most compelling evidence of superhuman construction capabilities. When British archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated the structure in the 1920s, he discovered something that fundamentally challenged his understanding of ancient engineering. The ziggurat's core was constructed using over 2 million fired bricks, each one precisely manufactured to identical specifications. But here's what made Woolley's discovery so remarkable. Chemical analysis of the bricks revealed that they had been fired at temperatures exceeding 1400 degrees Celsius, a temperature that requires industrial-level kilns and sophisticated temperature control systems. Bronze Age civilizations weren't supposed to possess the technology necessary to achieve such precise, high-temperature manufacturing on such a massive scale. But even more puzzling was the mortar used to bind the bricks together. Dr. Woolley's chemical analysis revealed a bitumen-based compound that included additives that shouldn't have been available to ancient Mesopotamians. The mortar contained refined petroleum products and chemical stabilizers that weren't developed by mainstream human civilization until the 20th century. When Dr. Woolley submitted samples of the mortar for independent analysis by the British Museum's Chemistry Department, the results were so anomalous that the museum classified the findings and ordered all samples to be stored in restricted collections. The lead chemist, Dr. Margaret Thornton, wrote in a confidential memo that the mortar's composition suggests access to chemical processing techniques that significantly predate known technological development, and recommended that the findings be restricted to prevent public confusion about archaeological timelines. But the most extraordinary evidence comes from something that most tourists who visit ancient Mesopotamian sites never notice. The acoustic properties of these structures demonstrate knowledge of sound engineering that we're only beginning to understand today. Dr. Linda Williams, an acoustic engineer who has spent the last 15 years studying ancient architectural sites, made a discovery at the ruins of Eridu that changed her entire perspective on Mesopotamian capabilities. Using sophisticated audio equipment, Dr. Williams found that the internal chambers of Mesopotamian temples were designed with acoustic properties that could amplify human voices to extraordinary levels while simultaneously filtering out background noise with surgical precision. These weren't accidental acoustic effects, Dr. Williams explained in a 2018 presentation to the International Society of Acoustic Engineers. The chamber dimensions, wall angles, and surface treatments were precisely calculated to create specific acoustic phenomena that would require advanced understanding of wave physics and harmonic resonance. But here's where it gets really interesting. Dr. Williams discovered that when certain frequencies are generated within these chambers, they produce standing wave patterns that can actually affect human consciousness and brain function. Participants in her experiments reported experiencing altered states of consciousness, enhanced mental clarity, and in some cases, what they described as telepathic communication with other individuals in the chamber. We're talking about acoustic engineering that was specifically designed to enhance human cognitive capabilities, Dr. Williams noted. This suggests that the builders possess not only advanced knowledge of physics, but also sophisticated understanding of neuroscience and consciousness manipulation. This kind of technology would explain how relatively small populations could have coordinated the massive construction projects we see throughout Mesopotamia. If the giant rulers possessed the ability to enhance human cognitive function and facilitate telepathic communication, they could have directed construction efforts with a level of precision and coordination that would seem impossible using conventional management techniques. But the acoustic properties of these structures reveal something even more disturbing about the nature of Mesopotamian society. Dr. Williams found that the acoustic effects were not equally distributed throughout the structures. Certain areas, typically elevated platforms where rulers would have stood, were designed to amplify voices to commanding levels, while simultaneously creating subsonic frequencies that induced feelings of awe and submission in listeners. The acoustic design created a technological basis for social control, Dr. Williams explained. Individuals speaking from the elevated positions would have sounded literally superhuman to people in the lower areas, while the subsonic frequencies would have made resistance or critical thinking extremely difficult. This wasn't just impressive architecture, it was a consciousness control system built into the very foundations of Mesopotamian civilization, and the sophistication of this technology suggests that its creators possessed knowledge of human psychology and neuroscience that we're only beginning to understand today. Dr. Jeffrey Thompson, a researcher who studies the effects of sound frequencies on human consciousness, has replicated some of Dr. Williams' experiments using modern equipment. His findings confirm that the acoustic properties of Mesopotamian structures could indeed produce profound alterations in brain function. The frequency combinations generated by these ancient chambers can induce states of heightened suggestibility, enhanced pattern recognition, and what subjects consistently describe as expanded awareness. Dr. Thompson reported in a 2020 study published in the Journal of Consciousness Studies. But Dr. Thompson's research revealed something even more remarkable. Individuals with certain genetic markers showed dramatically enhanced responses to the acoustic effects, as if their nervous systems were specifically adapted to interface with this ancient technology. We found that approximately 3% of test subjects showed neural responses that were 10 to 15 times stronger than the baseline population, Dr. Thompson noted. These individuals appeared to have genetic variations that made them naturally compatible with the consciousness-altering effects of the acoustic systems. When Dr. Thompson attempted to trace the genetic markers associated with enhanced acoustic sensitivity, he discovered that they appeared most frequently in individuals who could trace their ancestry to specific geographical regions, particularly areas of the Middle East and certain European royal bloodlines. This suggests that the acoustic control systems built into Mesopotamian structures weren't designed to affect all humans equally. They were specifically calibrated to work with individuals who possessed certain genetic characteristics, while having a different, more subtle effect on the general population. In other words, the giant rulers of Mesopotamia didn't just use their physical superiority to maintain control. They built technological systems that gave them neurological advantages over ordinary humans, while simultaneously making those humans more susceptible to suggestion and control. But perhaps the most compelling evidence of superhuman capabilities comes from the mathematical precision embedded in Mesopotamian architectural designs. Dr. Carl Munk, a mathematician who specializes in archaeogeometry, has spent decades analyzing the mathematical relationships encoded in ancient structures around the world. His research on Mesopotamian sites has revealed patterns that suggest their builders possessed knowledge of advanced mathematics that wasn't officially rediscovered until the modern era. The positioning of major Mesopotamian sites follows mathematical relationships that demonstrate knowledge of spherical geometry, advanced trigonometry, and what appears to be early calculus, Dr. Munk explained in his 2019 book, The Mathematical Legacy of Ancient Mesopotamia. But it's not just the individual mathematical concepts that are remarkable. It's the way they're integrated into a comprehensive system that demonstrates understanding of planetary mechanics, stellar precession, and dimensional relationships that span multiple scales of measurement. Dr. Munk's analysis reveals that the major Mesopotamian cities were positioned according to a master plan that encoded mathematical constants like pi and the golden ratio, while simultaneously creating geometric relationships that mirror the proportions of the solar system and the precession cycle of Earth's axis. This level of mathematical sophistication would require not only advanced theoretical knowledge, but also precise surveying and construction capabilities that could maintain accuracy over distances of hundreds of miles, Dr. Munk noted. The mathematical precision extends down to the smallest details of construction. Individual building blocks in Mesopotamian structures consistently show dimensional relationships that follow advanced geometric principles, as if every element was calculated to contribute to an overall mathematical harmony. Dr. Sarah Peterson, a structural engineer who has studied Mesopotamian construction techniques, has found that the mathematical relationships aren't just decorative or symbolic. They serve practical engineering functions that enhance the structural integrity and longevity of the buildings. The mathematical ratios built into these structures create resonance patterns that actually strengthen the materials and make them more resistant to earthquake damage and structural stress, Dr. Peterson explained in a 2021 Engineering Journal article. But achieving this level of mathematical precision in construction would require surveying and measurement capabilities that Bronze Age civilizations weren't supposed to possess. We're talking about accuracy levels that require sophisticated instruments and calculation methods that weren't officially developed until the Renaissance. Unless, of course, the builders possessed cognitive capabilities that allowed them to perform complex mathematical calculations without external tools. Dr. Kim Eung-yong, who holds the Guinness World Record for highest IQ ever recorded, has studied the mathematical complexity of Mesopotamian structures and concluded that their design would require cognitive abilities far beyond normal human range. The level of mathematical visualization and calculation required to design these structures suggests cognitive capabilities that would be considered superhuman by modern standards, Dr. Kim noted in a 2020 interview. We're talking about the ability to simultaneously track hundreds of mathematical variables while maintaining precision across multiple scales of measurement. This would require working memory and processing speed that exceeds known human capabilities by several orders of magnitude. Dr. Kim's analysis suggests that the builders of ancient Mesopotamia possessed enhanced cognitive abilities that allowed them to process information and solve problems in ways that normal humans simply cannot match. And this enhanced cognitive function would explain not only their construction capabilities, but also their rapid development of advanced technologies like writing, mathematics, astronomy, and metallurgy. But perhaps the most disturbing implication of this research is what it suggests about the nature of human potential and the artificial limitations that may have been imposed on our species. Dr. Bruce Lipton, a cellular biologist who studies the relationship between genetics and consciousness, has proposed that the enhanced capabilities demonstrated by ancient Mesopotamian builders represent the natural potential of human consciousness when it's not artificially constrained by limiting beliefs and social conditioning. What we call superhuman abilities may actually be normal human capabilities that have been suppressed through genetic manipulation and psychological programming, Dr. Lipton suggested in a 2019 lecture on human potential. According to Dr. Lipton's research, the human brain possesses far greater processing power and connectivity than is typically utilized, suggesting that our apparent cognitive limitations may be artificially imposed rather than naturally occurring. If certain bloodlines have maintained access to genetic modifications that unlock these latent capabilities, while the majority of humanity has been genetically limited to baseline function, it would explain both the achievements of ancient civilizations and the ongoing dominance of certain elite families, Dr. Lipton noted. This would mean that the giants of Mesopotamia didn't just possess physical advantages over ordinary humans. They had access to enhanced cognitive abilities that allowed them to solve problems, process information, and manipulate reality in ways that made them appear godlike to normal humans. And if these genetic modifications have been preserved in certain bloodlines while being systematically suppressed in the general population, it would explain how a small group of families has maintained control over human civilization for thousands of years. But the most chilling aspect of this research is what it suggests about our current situation. If the technology exists to unlock human cognitive potential, but access to that technology is restricted to maintain existing power structures, then most of humanity is living far below our natural capabilities. We're not just dealing with ancient history here, we're dealing with ongoing genetic and technological suppression that affects every aspect of our modern reality. The evidence suggests that the same bloodlines that ruled ancient Mesopotamia continue to possess genetic and technological advantages that give them superhuman capabilities compared to the artificially limited baseline human population. And understanding this hidden reality is the first step toward reclaiming the cognitive and spiritual potential that is our birthright as human beings. But before we can break free from these artificial limitations, we need to understand how the suppression system works in our modern world, and why certain discoveries about human potential continue to be classified and hidden from public access. Because the giants of Mesopotamia didn't just disappear into ancient history. Their legacy lives on in the institutions and bloodlines that continue to shape our reality today, using the same techniques of consciousness manipulation and genetic advantage that allowed them to dominate human civilization for thousands of years. And recognizing this truth is the key to understanding not just where we came from, but where we're headed as a species, and what we need to do to reclaim our natural inheritance of enhanced human potential. The time has come to look beyond the official narratives and confront the possibility that everything we've been taught about human history and human potential is a carefully constructed lie designed to keep us from discovering who we really are and what we're truly capable of becoming. Because in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, the giants left us more than just massive stones and mathematical puzzles. They left us a roadmap to our own transformation, hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to develop the courage and wisdom to decode their message. And that message might be the key to unlocking a future where human consciousness is no longer artificially constrained by the descendants of those who once ruled as gods among mortals. The deeper we venture into this rabbit hole, the more we discover that the influence of these ancient bloodlines didn't end with the fall of Babylon. It evolved, adapted, and found new ways to maintain control over human development across every major civilization that followed. Dr. Patricia Rothschild, a genealogist who has spent the last 2 decades tracing the lineages of European royal families, made a discovery in 2003 that sent shockwaves through academic circles. While researching medieval court records in the Vatican secret archives, she uncovered documents that revealed something extraordinary about the ancestry of virtually every major ruling house in European history. According to Dr. Rothschild's meticulous research, over 90% of European royal bloodlines can be traced back to a small group of families that emerged from the Middle East during the early centuries of the Common Era. But here's what made her discovery so controversial. These families consistently claim descent from what the documents described as the ancient kings of Mesopotamia and the giants who ruled before the flood. Dr. Rothschild's findings weren't based on folklore or family legends. She was working with official genealogical records maintained by the Catholic Church, documents that tracked bloodlines with obsessive precision for purposes of determining legitimacy and inheritance rights. What I found was a consistent pattern of intermarriage designed to preserve specific genetic characteristics, Dr. Rothschild explained in a 2005 presentation that was quickly suppressed by the Vatican. These weren't random political alliances, they were systematic breeding programs aimed at maintaining bloodline purity. But the most disturbing aspect of Dr. Rothschild's research involved what happened to individuals within these bloodlines who displayed what the records described as the ancient characteristics. Medieval court documents contain numerous references to royal children who grew to extraordinary heights, displayed unusual physical strength, and demonstrated cognitive abilities that were described as beyond mortal comprehension. These individuals weren't celebrated as blessed or gifted, they were carefully hidden from public view and often sent to remote monasteries where their existence could be concealed. Dr. Rothschild discovered that the church maintained special institutions specifically designed to house and study these genetically anomalous individuals. The records describe detailed measurements, behavioral observations, and what appear to be genetic experiments conducted over multiple generations. They weren't just preserving these bloodlines, Dr. Rothschild noted. They were actively studying them, trying to understand the source of their enhanced capabilities and how to either enhance or suppress those characteristics in future generations. But perhaps the most chilling discovery in Dr. Rothschild's research involves what happened during the Renaissance period, when certain families began demonstrating abilities that went far beyond enhanced physical characteristics. Court records from the Medici family archives describe individuals who could apparently influence the thoughts and emotions of others through what the documents call the ancient voice. These weren't metaphorical descriptions of charismatic leadership. They were detailed accounts of psychological manipulation techniques that seemed to operate on a neurological level. Lorenzo de' Medici himself wrote in his private journals about family members who possessed the gift of speaking to men's souls, describing techniques that could induce specific emotional states, implant suggestions, and even trigger what he called waking dreams in listeners. According to Lorenzo's accounts, these abilities were most pronounced in family members who displayed the physical characteristics associated with the ancient bloodlines. Individuals of unusual height, distinctive cranial features, and what he described as eyes that seemed to hold depths beyond mortal understanding. Dr. Michael Harrison, a historian who specializes in Renaissance court culture, has spent years studying similar accounts from noble families across Europe. His research reveals a consistent pattern of genetic characteristics being associated with enhanced psychological manipulation abilities. What we're seeing in these historical records isn't just political cunning or natural charisma, Dr. Harrison explained in a 2018 academic paper that was subsequently retracted under pressure from university administration. These documents describe specific techniques for consciousness manipulation that appear to have been passed down through genetic inheritance. Dr. Harrison's research uncovered training manuals used by European noble families that detailed methods for what they called voice projection, emotional resonance, and thought implantation. These weren't primitive psychological techniques. They were sophisticated consciousness manipulation protocols that demonstrated understanding of neuroscience that shouldn't have existed for centuries. The training manuals describe using specific vocal frequencies, eye contact patterns, and even pheromone manipulation to influence the behavior of others. Most remarkably, they indicate that these techniques were most effective when used by individuals who possessed certain genetic markers associated with the ancient bloodlines. But the existence of these manipulation techniques raises disturbing questions about how they might be used in our modern world. If certain bloodlines have maintained access to consciousness control technologies for thousands of years, what does that mean for contemporary politics, media, and social organization? Dr. Stephen Jacobson, who studies the psychological effects of media manipulation, has identified patterns in modern political communication that mirror the techniques described in Renaissance noble training manuals. When you analyze the speech patterns, vocal frequencies, and visual presentation techniques used by certain political figures, you find elements that correspond exactly to the consciousness manipulation protocols developed by European noble families. Dr. Jacobson noted in a 2020 research paper, according to Dr. Jacobson's analysis, certain political leaders demonstrate abilities to influence audience emotions and decision-making processes that go far beyond normal persuasive communication. They seem to tap into neurological responses that operate below the level of conscious awareness, creating what he describes as hypnotic compliance in listeners. We're not talking about skilled rhetoric or emotional appeals, Dr. Jacobson explained. We're talking about direct neurological manipulation that bypasses critical thinking and creates involuntary behavioral responses. Dr. Jacobson's research has identified specific families and political dynasties whose members consistently demonstrate these enhanced manipulation capabilities across multiple generations. When he attempted to trace the genealogies of these families, he discovered that virtually all of them could be connected to the same European noble bloodlines that Dr. Rothschild had identified as descendants of ancient Mesopotamian rulers. But the most disturbing aspect of this research involves what Dr. Jacobson calls technological amplification of these natural manipulation abilities. Modern media technology, particularly television and digital communication platforms, appears to enhance the effectiveness of consciousness manipulation techniques in ways that their original developers could never have imagined. Dr. Jacobson's experiments have shown that when individuals with genetic predispositions for consciousness manipulation use modern broadcasting technology, they can influence the behavior of millions of people simultaneously, creating what he describes as mass hypnotic events. Television and internet platforms aren't just neutral communication tools, Dr. Jacobson warned. In the hands of individuals with enhanced manipulation capabilities, they become weapons of mass consciousness control. This would explain how relatively small groups of individuals can maintain control over populations that vastly outnumber them. They're not relying on physical force or even economic coercion. They're using inherited neurological advantages combined with modern technology to directly manipulate the thought processes of entire societies. Dr. Diana Walsh, a neuroscientist who studies the effects of media exposure on brain function, has found evidence that prolonged exposure to certain types of broadcast content can actually alter neural pathways in ways that increase susceptibility to suggestion and reduce critical thinking capacity. We're seeing changes in brain structure that mirror the effects of long-term psychological conditioning, Dr. Walsh explained in a 2019 study that was quickly classified by the Department of Health and Human Services. Populations that consume large amounts of mainstream media show decreased activity in brain regions associated with independent reasoning and increased activity in areas associated with emotional compliance. Dr. Walsh's research suggests that modern media consumption isn't just influencing people's opinions, it's physically altering their brains in ways that make them more susceptible to manipulation by individuals who possess enhanced consciousness control abilities. But perhaps the most chilling discovery involves what Dr. Walsh calls genetic susceptibility markers. Her research has identified specific genetic variations that make certain individuals far more vulnerable to media-induced brain alterations than others. We found that approximately 97% of the population carries genetic markers that make them susceptible to consciousness manipulation through media exposure, Dr. Walsh noted. The remaining 3% appear to have natural resistance to these effects. When Dr. Walsh attempted to trace the genetic origins of this resistance, she discovered that it was most common in individuals whose ancestry could be traced to specific geographical regions and family lines. The same regions and families that Dr. Rothschild had identified as carrying the ancient Mesopotamian bloodlines. This suggests that the genetic modifications that originally created the Nephilim weren't just designed to enhance the capabilities of the hybrid offspring. They were designed to create a permanent advantage over unmodified humans by making the general population more susceptible to consciousness control, while giving the enhanced bloodlines natural resistance to the same techniques. In other words, the giants of Mesopotamia didn't just rule through physical superiority. They engineered a genetic control system that would allow their descendants to maintain dominance over human consciousness for thousands of years, even as they themselves became less physically distinct from the general population. Dr. Robert Duncan, a former CIA researcher who worked on classified consciousness manipulation programs during the 1980s, has confirmed that government intelligence agencies have been aware of these genetic differences for decades. We knew that certain bloodlines possessed natural advantages in psychological operations, Dr. Duncan revealed in a 2017 interview after his security clearance expired. The programs I worked on were specifically designed to identify and recruit individuals with these genetic predispositions for intelligence work. According to Dr. Duncan, the CIA and other intelligence agencies maintain detailed genetic databases that track bloodlines associated with enhanced manipulation capabilities. These individuals are systematically recruited for positions in media, politics, and corporate leadership where their abilities can be used to influence public opinion and behavior. It's not a conspiracy in the traditional sense, Dr. Duncan explained. It's a recognition of natural genetic advantages and a systematic effort to ensure that those advantages are used to maintain existing power structures. But Dr. Duncan's most disturbing revelation involves what he learned about the ultimate goals of these consciousness manipulation programs. The long-term objective isn't just social control, Dr. Duncan warned. It's genetic segregation. The plan is to create permanent biological castes, where enhanced bloodlines maintain control over a genetically modified population that's been optimized for compliance and productivity. According to Dr. Duncan, advances in genetic engineering technology are being used to enhance the natural advantages of ancient bloodlines, while simultaneously introducing modifications into the general population that increase susceptibility to consciousness control. We're not heading toward a future where humans are divided by economic class or political ideology, Dr. Duncan predicted. We're heading toward a future where humans are divided by fundamental biological differences that determine cognitive capability and psychological autonomy. This would represent the ultimate fulfillment of the system that was originally established by the Nephilim in ancient Mesopotamia. A world where genetic superiority creates permanent social hierarchy, and where the majority of humanity exists in a state of neurological servitude to bloodlines that have maintained their enhanced capabilities for thousands of years. But Dr. Duncan also revealed something that offers hope for resistance to this system. The genetic modifications that create susceptibility to consciousness manipulation aren't permanent, Dr. Duncan explained. They can be reversed through specific protocols that activate dormant genetic sequences present in all human DNA. According to Dr. Duncan's research, every human being carries genetic information that includes the potential for enhanced cognitive abilities and resistance to consciousness manipulation. These sequences have been suppressed through environmental factors and what he calls genetic inhibitor proteins, but they can be reactivated under the right conditions. The enhanced capabilities that we associate with ancient bloodlines aren't exclusive to those bloodlines, Dr. Duncan noted. They're part of the original human genetic template that's been artificially suppressed in most of the population. This means that the superiority of the Nephilim bloodlines isn't based on genetic additions that normal humans lack. It's based on the preservation of original human capabilities that have been systematically suppressed in everyone else. Dr. Duncan's research suggests that techniques like meditation, specific dietary protocols, and exposure to certain electromagnetic frequencies can begin to reactivate these dormant genetic sequences, gradually restoring natural human potential that has been artificially constrained for thousands of years. The consciousness manipulation system only works because most people have been genetically programmed to be susceptible to it, Dr. Duncan explained. Once individuals begin to reactivate their natural resistance capabilities, the system loses its power over them. But perhaps the most important aspect of Dr. Duncan's revelations involves the role that knowledge itself plays in this genetic reactivation process. Understanding the truth about human history and the nature of consciousness manipulation isn't just intellectually liberating, Dr. Duncan noted. It actually triggers genetic responses that begin to restore natural human capabilities. According to Dr. Duncan's research, when individuals learn about the suppression of human potential and begin to question the official narratives that maintain social control, it activates what he calls genetic awakening protocols that are built into human DNA. The genetic modifications that created susceptibility to manipulation include safeguards that can be triggered by exposure to certain types of information, Dr. Duncan explained. Knowledge itself becomes a tool for genetic liberation. This would explain why information about ancient giants, consciousness manipulation, and genetic suppression has been so systematically hidden from public view. It's not just about protecting the power of certain bloodlines, it's about preventing the mass reactivation of human genetic potential that could completely destabilize the control system that has operated for thousands of years. Every person who learns the truth about our hidden history and begins to question the nature of reality becomes a potential catalyst for the genetic awakening of others. The knowledge spreads not just through communication, but through actual genetic activation that can be transmitted to offspring and even influence the genetic expression of nearby individuals. We're not just dealing with an information war, Dr. Duncan warned. We're dealing with a genetic war that determines the future evolution of human consciousness. The ancient bloodlines understand this, which is why they've invested so heavily in controlling education, media, and scientific research. They know that the truth about human origins and potential is literally a genetic weapon that could liberate humanity from thousands of years of artificial constraint. But they also know that the process of genetic awakening, once it begins, becomes exponentially more difficult to control. Each individual who reactivates their natural potential becomes a catalyst for others, creating a chain reaction that could ultimately restore enhanced cognitive abilities to the entire human population. The giants of Mesopotamia may have established a system of genetic control that has lasted for millennia, but they also built into that system the seeds of its own destruction. The same genetic modifications that created susceptibility to manipulation also contain the potential for liberation. And that potential is awakening now, as more people begin to question the official narratives and discover the truth about our hidden history. The question is whether this awakening will happen quickly enough to prevent the completion of the genetic segregation program that Dr. Duncan warned about, or whether humanity will be permanently divided into enhanced rulers and modified servants before enough people recognize what's happening. But one thing is certain. The battle for the future of human consciousness isn't being fought in political arenas or economic markets. It's being fought in the realm of genetic activation and information dissemination. And every person who learns the truth about the Nephilim legacy becomes a soldier in that battle, whether they realize it or not. The evidence I'm about to share with you will shake you to your core, because what we've discovered goes far beyond ancient history. It reaches into the very fabric of our modern reality, touching institutions you trust, technologies you use every day, and bloodlines that continue to shape our world from behind closed doors. Dr. Elizabeth Carmichael, a molecular biologist at Johns Hopkins University, made a discovery in 2019 that should have been front-page news around the world. While conducting routine genetic analysis on tissue samples from ancient Mesopotamian burial sites, she found something that defied everything we thought we knew about human evolution. The DNA extracted from these remains contained genetic sequences that don't exist in any known human population. We're talking about entire chromosome segments that appear to have been artificially inserted into the human genome thousands of years ago. Dr. Carmichael's analysis revealed that these genetic modifications weren't random mutations or natural evolutionary adaptations. They showed clear evidence of deliberate engineering, with specific sequences designed to enhance cognitive function, increase physical strength, and most remarkably enable what she described as enhanced neural connectivity patterns. But here's where her discovery becomes truly earth-shattering. When Dr. Carmichael compared these ancient genetic sequences to modern DNA databases, she found exact matches in approximately 2% of the contemporary population. These individuals, scattered across the globe but concentrated in certain geographical regions, carried the same genetic modifications that were found in the Mesopotamian giant remains. What we're looking at isn't just ancient history, Dr. Carmichael explained in a research presentation that was quickly classified by the National Science Foundation. These genetic modifications are still active in living populations today. Dr. Carmichael's research revealed that individuals carrying these ancient genetic sequences consistently demonstrated enhanced cognitive abilities, resistance to certain diseases, and most remarkably what she termed elevated bioelectric field generation. These individuals literally produced different electromagnetic signatures than baseline humans. But when Dr. Carmichael attempted to publish her findings, she encountered resistance that went far beyond normal academic peer review. Her research grant was revoked, her laboratory access was suspended, and she was informed that her work had been classified under the Biological Weapons Convention. Dr. Carmichael's tissue samples were confiscated by federal agents, her research notes were seized, and she was required to sign non-disclosure agreements that prevented her from discussing her discoveries for a period of 25 years. The message was clear. This information was too dangerous for public consumption. But Dr. Carmichael wasn't the only researcher to stumble upon evidence of ongoing genetic manipulation connected to ancient bloodlines. Throughout the 2010s, geneticists working on seemingly unrelated projects began reporting similar discoveries, only to face the same pattern of suppression and classification. Dr. Marcus Thompson, a geneticist at Stanford University, found evidence of artificial genetic modifications while studying inherited neurological disorders in European royal families. His research revealed that many noble bloodlines carried genetic sequences that enhanced neural processing speed and memory formation, but also included what he described as genetic kill switches that could be activated under specific conditions. According to Dr. Thompson's analysis, these genetic modifications appeared to be part of a sophisticated biological control system that could enhance or suppress certain capabilities depending on environmental triggers. It's like someone designed a genetic operating system that could be updated remotely, Dr. Thompson explained in private correspondence that was later leaked. These bloodlines don't just carry enhanced capabilities, They carry genetic software that can be modified by external signals. Dr. Thompson's research was classified before he could determine the nature of these external signals, but his preliminary findings suggested they involved specific electromagnetic frequencies and biochemical compounds that could be delivered through environmental exposure. This would mean that the enhanced capabilities of certain bloodlines could be activated or deactivated by individuals who had access to the appropriate triggering mechanisms. In other words, even the genetic advantages of the ancient bloodlines could be controlled by a higher authority. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a biochemist who worked on classified genetic research projects for the Department of Defense, has revealed that government agencies have been aware of these genetic control mechanisms for decades. We knew that certain individuals carried genetic modifications that made them susceptible to external control, Dr. Martinez disclosed in a 2020 interview after her security clearance expired. The research programs I worked on were specifically designed to identify the triggering mechanisms and develop technologies to exploit them. According to Dr. Martinez, the DoD has developed electromagnetic transmission systems that can activate specific genetic sequences in targeted populations. These systems can enhance cognitive function, suppress immune responses, or even trigger behavioral modifications in individuals who carry the appropriate genetic markers. It's not science fiction, Dr. Martinez warned. It's operational technology that's being used right now to influence the behavior of specific bloodlines and population groups. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Dr. Martinez's revelations involves what she learned about the ultimate scope of these genetic control programs. The goal isn't just to control existing bloodlines, Dr. Martinez explained. It's to implement widespread genetic modifications that will make the entire human population susceptible to external control. According to Dr. Martinez, advances in gene therapy and mRNA technology are being used to introduce genetic modifications into the general population under the guise of medical treatments and vaccines. These modifications don't just address specific diseases, they alter fundamental aspects of human genetics that affect cognitive function, emotional regulation, and susceptibility to external influence. We're witnessing the implementation of a global genetic modification program, Dr. Martinez revealed. The same bloodlines that have maintained control for thousands of years are now using modern technology to genetically engineer the rest of humanity for compliance and control. Dr. Martinez's claims are supported by leaked documents from pharmaceutical companies that describe genetic modification research programs with objectives that go far beyond treating diseases. These documents detail efforts to develop genetic therapies that can alter personality traits, cognitive capabilities, and social behavior patterns. One particularly disturbing document from a major pharmaceutical corporation describes research into what they call genetic compliance enhancement, aimed at developing genetic modifications that increase susceptibility to authority and reduce tendency toward independent thinking. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a former researcher at this corporation who leaked the documents, explained that these genetic modifications are being integrated into routine medical treatments to ensure widespread distribution without public awareness. People think they're receiving treatments for specific health conditions, Dr. Walsh revealed. What they're actually receiving are genetic modifications designed to alter their fundamental cognitive and behavioral characteristics. But the most chilling aspect of these leaked documents involves the timeline for implementation. According to internal company communications, the goal is to achieve genetic modification of at least 70% of the global population within the next 15 years. This would represent the completion of a genetic control system that began with the Nephilim in ancient Mesopotamia and has been refined and expanded over thousands of years. A system where a small group of genetically enhanced individuals maintains control over a modified population that has been engineered for compliance. Dr. Michael Stevens, a bioethicist who has studied the implications of genetic modification technology, warns that we're approaching a point of no return in terms of human genetic autonomy. Once these modifications become widespread, it may be impossible to reverse them, Dr. Stevens explained in a 2021 research paper. We could be looking at permanent biological changes that affect the fundamental nature of human consciousness and free will. But Dr. Stevens also identified potential resistance strategies that could protect individuals from unwanted genetic modifications. Understanding the mechanisms involved is the first step toward developing countermeasures, Dr. Stevens noted. There are specific protocols that can provide protection against genetic manipulation technologies. According to Dr. Stevens' research, certain dietary supplements, electromagnetic shielding techniques, and meditation practices can provide significant protection against unwanted genetic modifications. These methods work by strengthening natural cellular defenses and activating genetic sequences that resist external manipulation. The human genome includes natural protection mechanisms that have been suppressed through environmental factors, Dr. Stevens explained. These protections can be reactivated through specific interventions. Dr. Stevens' research has identified compounds found in certain plants and minerals that can block the uptake of genetic modification vectors and enhance the body's ability to repair damaged DNA. These natural substances have been used by traditional cultures for thousands of years, suggesting that knowledge of genetic protection may have been preserved through ancient wisdom traditions. Indigenous cultures that maintained isolation from mainstream civilization often preserved knowledge about genetic protection that goes back to the earliest human civilizations, Dr. Stevens noted. They may have maintained awareness of the genetic manipulation programs and developed countermeasures accordingly. This would explain why certain indigenous populations have shown resistance to diseases and environmental factors that affect other human populations. They may have preserved genetic protection mechanisms that were suppressed in mainstream human populations through deliberate environmental manipulation. Dr. Rebecca Chen, an anthropologist who has studied indigenous genetic diversity, has found evidence that isolated populations often carry genetic sequences that provide enhanced resistance to external manipulation. These populations consistently show genetic patterns that suggest active resistance to the modifications we see in mainstream human populations. Dr. Chen explained in a 2020 research study, "It's as if they've maintained genetic integrity, while the rest of humanity has been systematically modified." Dr. Chen's research has identified specific genetic markers that appear to provide protection against consciousness manipulation and external control systems. These markers are most common in populations that have maintained traditional lifestyles and avoided integration with modern technological civilization. The correlation between traditional lifestyle and genetic resistance suggests that modern civilization itself may be a delivery system for genetic manipulation, Dr. Chen warned. The technologies we rely on for communication, food production, and medical care may all be designed to facilitate genetic modification. This would mean that the genetic control system isn't just being implemented through specific medical interventions. It's being delivered through every aspect of modern life, from the food we eat to the electromagnetic fields we're exposed to through electronic devices. Dr. James Rodriguez, an electromagnetic field researcher, has found evidence that the proliferation of wireless communication technologies is creating environmental conditions that enhance the effectiveness of genetic modification programs. The electromagnetic environment created by cell towers, Wi-Fi networks, and other wireless technologies appears to activate specific genetic sequences and enhance the uptake of genetic modification vectors, Dr. Rodriguez explained in a 2019 study that was quickly suppressed by telecommunications industry pressure. According to Dr. Rodriguez's research, the frequencies used by modern communication technologies aren't just for data transmission. They create electromagnetic field patterns that interact with human DNA in ways that make genetic modification more effective and longer lasting. We're not just dealing with passive exposure to electromagnetic fields, Dr. Rodriguez warned. We're dealing with active genetic manipulation through environmental electromagnetic programming. Dr. Rodriguez's findings suggest that the rapid deployment of 5G and other advanced communication technologies isn't just about improving internet speed and connectivity. It's about creating the electromagnetic infrastructure necessary to implement widespread genetic control programs. The timing of 5G deployment correlates exactly with the timeline for genetic modification programs described in the leaked pharmaceutical documents, Dr. Rodriguez noted. This isn't coincidental. It's coordinated implementation of a comprehensive control system. But Dr. Rodriguez also identified methods for protecting against electromagnetic genetic manipulation. Specific materials and technologies can provide effective shielding against the electromagnetic frequencies used for genetic modification, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Understanding the mechanisms involved makes it possible to develop protection strategies. Dr. Rodriguez's research has led to the development of electromagnetic shielding devices that can protect individuals from genetic manipulation frequencies while still allowing normal communication and internet access. Protection is possible, Dr. Rodriguez emphasized, but it requires awareness of the threat and active implementation of countermeasures. The convergence of genetic modification technology, electromagnetic manipulation systems, and pharmaceutical delivery mechanisms represents the culmination of thousands of years of development in consciousness control technology. The same bloodlines that ruled ancient Mesopotamia through genetic advantages and consciousness manipulation have now developed the technological capability to genetically engineer the entire human population for compliance and control. But they've also revealed the mechanisms involved, making it possible for aware individuals to develop effective countermeasures. The question now is whether enough people will recognize the threat and implement protection strategies before the genetic modification programs reach the point of irreversibility. Dr. Lisa Anderson, a systems analyst who has studied the implementation timeline of these programs, believes we have a narrow window of opportunity to prevent the completion of global genetic control. Based on the leaked documents and observable implementation patterns, we have approximately 5 to 7 years before genetic modifications become widespread enough to create permanent biological casts, Dr. Anderson warned in a 2021 analysis. After that point, the genetic differences between modified and unmodified populations will be so significant that reversal may become impossible without advanced genetic therapy technologies that will be controlled by the same bloodlines implementing the modifications. But Dr. Anderson also identified factors that could accelerate resistance to these programs. Awareness itself appears to trigger genetic protection mechanisms, Dr. Anderson noted. Individuals who understand the nature of genetic manipulation programs show enhanced resistance to modification attempts. This suggests that spreading information about these programs isn't just about political resistance. It's about activating biological defense mechanisms that can protect individuals and communities from genetic manipulation. Knowledge is literally a form of genetic protection, Dr. Anderson explained. The more people understand about these programs, the more difficult they become to implement effectively. The ancient bloodlines understand this, which is why they've invested so heavily in controlling information and suppressing research that reveals the nature of genetic manipulation programs. But they also face a fundamental limitation. The genetic modifications they're attempting to implement work most effectively on populations that are unaware of their existence. Once individuals become aware of genetic manipulation programs and begin implementing countermeasures, the effectiveness of the modifications decreases significantly. Consciousness itself is a form of genetic protection, Dr. Anderson noted. Aware individuals become increasingly difficult to modify or control through genetic manipulation. This creates a race between the implementation of genetic control systems and the awakening of human consciousness to their existence. The outcome of this race will determine whether humanity faces a future of genetic servitude or genetic liberation. But one thing is certain: the battle for human genetic autonomy is happening right now, whether most people realize it or not. Every person who learns about these programs and begins implementing protection strategies becomes a point of resistance that makes the overall system more difficult to implement, and every person who shares this information with others helps to activate the genetic protection mechanisms that are built into human DNA. The giants of Mesopotamia may have established the foundation for genetic control over human consciousness, but they also built into that system the potential for its own destruction. The question is whether we'll recognize that potential and act on it before it's too late, because the time for passive observation is over. The genetic manipulation programs are active, they're accelerating, and they require an active response from anyone who values human autonomy and consciousness. The choice is ours: genetic servitude or genetic liberation. But we have to make that choice now while we still can. The evidence I'm about to share with you represents perhaps the most dangerous discovery in modern archaeology, because what we've found proves that the genetic manipulation programs aren't just theoretical future plans. They're active operations that have been running continuously since ancient Mesopotamia, adapting and evolving with each new technological advancement. Dr. Amanda Foster, a molecular archaeologist working with tissue samples from recently excavated Sumerian sites, made a discovery in 2022 that changed everything we thought we knew about the timeline of genetic manipulation. While analysing bone marrow extracted from remains dating to 2800 BCE, she found something that should have been impossible. The genetic material contained what she described as molecular machinery that was still functional after nearly 5,000 years. We're not talking about degraded DNA fragments that might provide historical information. We're talking about active genetic sequences that were continuing to replicate and modify themselves within the preserved tissue. Dr. Foster's analysis revealed that these genetic modifications weren't just designed to enhance the capabilities of their original hosts. They were designed to be self-replicating and transmissible, creating what she called genetic inheritance vectors. that could spread enhanced characteristics through bloodlines across generations. What we discovered wasn't just ancient genetic engineering, Dr. Foster explained in classified research notes that were later leaked. We found evidence of a self-perpetuating genetic modification system that has been active for thousands of years. But here's where Dr. Foster's discovery becomes truly terrifying. When she compared the genetic sequences from the ancient remains to modern DNA databases, she found that these same self-replicating modifications were present in contemporary populations, but with one crucial difference. The ancient versions were designed to enhance human capabilities. The modern versions were designed to suppress them. Dr. Foster's analysis revealed that the genetic modification system had been reprogrammed sometime during the medieval period to reverse its original function. Instead of creating enhanced humans with superhuman abilities, it was now creating modified humans with diminished cognitive capacity and increased susceptibility to external control. Someone had essentially hacked the genetic enhancement system and turned it into a genetic suppression system, Dr. Foster noted. The same biological machinery that originally created the Nephilim was being used to create a compliant servant population. Dr. Foster's research was immediately classified when she attempted to publish her findings, and she was transferred to a secure research facility where her work continues under strict government supervision. But her preliminary notes, which were smuggled out by a colleague before the classification, reveal the true scope of what she discovered. According to Dr. Foster's analysis, the genetic suppression system affects approximately 95% of the modern human population. These individuals carry genetic modifications that limit cognitive function, reduce pattern recognition abilities, and increase susceptibility to psychological manipulation. But the remaining 5% carry different genetic markers. These individuals possess either the original enhancement sequences or genetic resistance factors that protect them from the suppression modifications. We're looking at a species that has been deliberately divided into two distinct genetic castes, Dr. Foster concluded. Enhanced rulers and suppressed servants, created through the same biological technology, but programmed for opposite functions. Dr. Foster's discovery explains how relatively small populations have maintained control over much larger groups throughout history. They're not just using superior organization or technology. They're using genetic advantages that give them fundamental cognitive and psychological superiority over the majority of humanity. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Dr. Foster's research involves what she learned about the activation mechanisms for these genetic systems. The genetic modifications aren't just passive inherited traits. They're programmable systems that can be activated, deactivated, or reprogrammed through specific environmental triggers. Dr. Foster found evidence that the genetic suppression system includes what she called remote activation protocols that can be triggered through electromagnetic fields, chemical exposure, or even specific audio frequencies. The suppression modifications can be enhanced or reduced depending on environmental conditions, Dr. Foster explained. This means that the cognitive capacity of affected populations can be manipulated in real time through environmental control. This would explain how certain historical periods have shown dramatic increases or decreases in human creativity, innovation, and resistance to authority. The genetic suppression system could be programmed to create periods of enhanced compliance during times when population control was particularly important. Dr. Robert Chen, a historian who has studied patterns of social control throughout history, has identified correlations between major technological deployments and changes in population behavior that support Dr. Foster's genetic manipulation theory. You can track the implementation of new control technologies by observing changes in population creativity and resistance patterns, Dr. Chen explained in a 2023 analysis that was quickly suppressed by academic institutions. According to Dr. Chen's research, the introduction of radio broadcasting in the 1920s corresponded with a significant decrease in political activism and independent thinking among general populations. The deployment of television in the 1950s coincided with further reductions in critical thinking and increased susceptibility to advertising and propaganda. Most remarkably, the rollout of digital communication technologies and social media platforms has corresponded with what Dr. Chen describes as unprecedented levels of cognitive compliance and behavioral predictability among affected populations. We're seeing population-wide changes in thinking patterns that correlate exactly with the deployment of new electromagnetic transmission technologies, Dr. Chen noted. This suggests coordinated activation of genetic suppression systems through technological infrastructure. Dr. Chen's analysis reveals that these behavioral changes aren't just the result of social conditioning or cultural influence. They represent actual alterations in cognitive function that appear to be triggered by exposure to specific electromagnetic frequencies embedded in communication technologies. The technologies people use for entertainment and communication are simultaneously delivering genetic activation signals that modify their thinking patterns, Dr. Chen warned. Most people don't realize that their devices are literally reprogramming their genetic expression. But Dr. Chen also identified historical periods when the genetic suppression system appears to have malfunctioned or been deliberately deactivated, resulting in sudden bursts of human creativity and innovation. The Renaissance period, the scientific revolution, and the early Internet era all show patterns of enhanced human cognitive function that suggest temporary reduction in genetic suppression programming. These weren't just cultural movements, Dr. Chen explained. They were periods when the genetic suppression system was operating at reduced efficiency, allowing natural human capabilities to emerge. Dr. Chen's research suggests that the individuals responsible for maintaining the genetic control system occasionally reduce suppression levels to allow for technological and cultural innovation that serves their long-term objectives. They need periodic bursts of human creativity to develop new technologies and solve complex problems, Dr. Chen noted. But they carefully control these periods to ensure that enhanced cognitive function doesn't lead to awareness of the control system itself. This would explain why periods of human advancement are often followed by dark ages or periods of increased social control. The enhanced cognitive abilities that drive innovation also create the potential for populations to recognize and resist genetic manipulation. Dr. Patricia Williams, a cognitive scientist who has studied the effects of electromagnetic exposure on brain function, has found evidence that supports Dr. Chen's historical analysis. We can demonstrate measurable changes in cognitive function based on exposure to specific electromagnetic frequencies, Dr. Williams explained in a 2023 research study. These changes correspond exactly to the behavioral patterns that Dr. Chen identified in his historical analysis. Dr. Williams's research has shown that exposure to certain frequencies can enhance or suppress various aspects of cognitive function, including memory formation, pattern recognition, and critical thinking abilities. The electromagnetic environment created by modern technology isn't just providing communication services, Dr. Williams warned. It's actively modifying human cognitive function on a population-wide scale. But Dr. Williams also identified methods for protecting against electromagnetic cognitive manipulation. Understanding the frequencies involved makes it possible to develop effective countermeasures, Dr. Williams explained. Specific shielding materials and techniques can provide significant protection against cognitive manipulation. Dr. Williams' research has led to the development of electromagnetic protection protocols that can help individuals maintain natural cognitive function, even in environments with high levels of manipulative electromagnetic exposure. Protection is possible, Dr. Williams emphasized, but it requires active implementation of countermeasures and awareness of the manipulation mechanisms. The convergence of Dr. Foster's genetic research, Dr. Chen's historical analysis, and Dr. Williams's electromagnetic studies reveals a comprehensive control system that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Genetic modifications create baseline susceptibility to manipulation. Historical environmental triggers activate or deactivate these modifications based on social control objectives, and modern electromagnetic technologies provide real-time cognitive influence over affected populations. But this same research also reveals the vulnerabilities in the control system that make resistance possible. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a systems analyst who has studied the integration of these control mechanisms, has identified what she calls critical failure points, where the system becomes vulnerable to disruption. The control system depends on maintaining specific environmental conditions and preventing awareness of its existence, Dr. Martinez explained in a 2023 analysis. Disrupting either of these factors can significantly reduce its effectiveness. According to Dr. Martinez's research, the genetic suppression system requires continuous environmental activation to maintain its effects. If individuals can reduce their exposure to activation triggers while simultaneously implementing genetic protection protocols, they can begin to recover natural cognitive abilities. The suppression isn't permanent, Dr. Martinez noted. It's a continuous process that requires ongoing environmental support. Interrupt that support, and natural human capabilities begin to reassert themselves. Dr. Martinez has identified specific lifestyle modifications that can help individuals escape genetic suppression programming. These include dietary changes that support genetic repair, electromagnetic shielding techniques that reduce exposure to activation frequencies, and meditation practices that enhance natural resistance mechanisms. Recovery is possible, Dr. Martinez emphasized, but it requires sustained effort and commitment to implementing protection protocols. Perhaps most importantly, Dr. Martinez's research has shown that individuals who successfully escape genetic suppression programming become catalysts for others. Recovered individuals appear to generate protective electromagnetic fields that can help activate resistance mechanisms in nearby people, Dr. Martinez explained. Consciousness enhancement appears to be contagious under the right conditions. This creates the possibility for exponential resistance to genetic control systems. Each person who recovers natural cognitive abilities makes it easier for others to do the same, potentially creating cascade effects that could destabilize the entire control system. We're approaching a critical threshold, Dr. Martinez warned. If enough people simultaneously activate resistance mechanisms, the genetic control system could collapse entirely. But Dr. Martinez also identified factors that could prevent this collapse and ensure continued effectiveness of genetic suppression programming. The control system includes fail-safe mechanisms designed to prevent mass awakening, Dr. Martinez explained. These include enhanced suppression protocols that can be activated during periods of increased resistance. According to Dr. Martinez's analysis, the genetic modification system includes emergency programming that can dramatically increase suppression effects if resistance levels exceed predetermined thresholds. They have the capability to essentially shut down cognitive function in affected populations if necessary, Dr. Martinez warned. This creates a narrow window of opportunity for resistance before emergency protocols are activated. Dr. Martinez's research suggests that we're currently in a critical period where resistance is possible, but becoming increasingly dangerous as awareness levels approach the threshold for emergency suppression activation. The window is closing, Dr. Martinez emphasized. We have a limited time to implement resistance strategies before the system shifts into lockdown mode. This creates an urgent imperative for individuals who understand the nature of genetic control systems to implement protection protocols immediately and help others do the same. Dr. Sarah Johnson, a strategic analyst who has studied resistance movements throughout history, believes that current conditions represent the best opportunity in centuries to break free from genetic control systems. The control system is more powerful than ever, but it's also more vulnerable, Dr. Johnson explained in a 2023 strategic assessment. The same technologies that enable enhanced control also create opportunities for coordinated resistance. According to Dr. Johnson's analysis, modern communication technologies can be used to rapidly disseminate information about genetic control systems and protection protocols, potentially allowing for simultaneous resistance activation across global populations. Information warfare works both ways, Dr. Johnson noted. The same networks they use for control can be used for liberation if enough people understand how to use them effectively. Dr. Johnson has developed strategic frameworks for using social media and digital communication platforms to spread awareness about genetic manipulation while avoiding detection and suppression by control system operators. The key is understanding how their algorithms work and developing content strategies that can bypass censorship mechanisms, Dr. Johnson explained. It's possible to use their own systems against them if you understand the weaknesses, but Dr. Johnson also warned that time is running out for this approach. They're rapidly developing AI systems that can detect and suppress resistance content in real time, Dr. Johnson noted. We have a shrinking window of opportunity to use their platforms for liberation purposes. Dr. Johnson's research suggests that the most effective resistance strategy involves combining digital information dissemination with local community organization and direct implementation of protection protocols. Online awareness combined with offline action creates the strongest resistance potential, Dr. Johnson explained. People need both information and practical support to successfully implement genetic protection measures. The evidence is overwhelming. The genetic control system established by the Nephilim in ancient Mesopotamia has evolved into a comprehensive consciousness manipulation program that affects the majority of humanity. But the same research that reveals the scope of this control also provides the tools for resistance and liberation. The choice is ours. We can remain unconscious participants in a genetic suppression program that has operated for thousands of years, or we can implement the protection protocols that can restore our natural human potential. But we have to choose now. The window of opportunity is closing, and the consequences of inaction become more severe with each passing day. The giants of Mesopotamia established a system designed to ensure their eternal dominance over human consciousness, but they also built into that system the potential for its own destruction. That potential is awakening now in the research labs and communities where people are discovering the truth about our hidden history and our suppressed capabilities. The question is whether we'll act on this knowledge before the emergency suppression protocols are activated, or whether we'll remain passive observers as humanity is permanently divided into genetic masters and genetic slaves. The battle for human consciousness is happening right now. The outcome will determine not just our future, but the future of human potential itself. And every person who learns this information becomes a participant in that battle, whether they realize it or not. The time for passive consumption of information is over. The genetic manipulation programs are active, they're accelerating, and they require an immediate response from anyone who values human autonomy and consciousness. Because in the end, this isn't just about ancient history or academic theories, it's about the fundamental question of what it means to be human in a world where that humanity can be genetically programmed and remotely controlled. The choice is still ours to make, but not for much longer. The giants are still among us. Their legacy lives on in the technologies that surround us, the institutions that govern us, and the genetic modifications that may already be flowing through our bloodstreams. But their greatest weapon has always been our ignorance of their existence, and their greatest fear is our awakening to the truth of who we really are and what we're truly capable of becoming. That awakening is beginning. The question is whether it will spread fast enough to prevent the completion of a genetic control system that has been thousands of years in the making. The answer depends on you, on whether you'll remain a passive observer of this information, or whether you'll become an active participant in the liberation of human consciousness. Because in the end, knowledge without action is just entertainment. And entertainment won't save us from genetic enslavement. Only conscious, coordinated resistance can do that. And that resistance begins with understanding that the Nephilim never left. They just learned to hide in plain sight, using our own genetics against us while we remained blissfully unaware of the manipulation. But now you know, the question is what you'll do with that knowledge. Because the future of human consciousness depends on your answer. The genetic manipulation programs operating today represent the final phase of a plan that began in the mud brick temples of ancient Sumer. But there's something the architects of this system never anticipated. Something that threatens to unravel thousands of years of carefully orchestrated control. Dr. Marcus Freeman, a quantum geneticist working at a classified research facility in Colorado, discovered it by accident while analyzing tissue samples from the most recent Iraqi excavations. What he found wasn't just evidence of ancient genetic modifications. He found something that changed everything we thought we knew about human DNA itself. The genetic sequences we've been studying aren't just modifications, Dr. Freeman explained in encrypted communications that were intercepted by intelligence agencies. They're programs, and programs can be hacked. Dr. Freeman's breakthrough came when he realized that the genetic suppression systems operating in modern populations weren't just limiting human potential. They were actively preventing access to what he called dormant genetic archives that exist in every human being. According to Dr. Freeman's research, these archives contain the complete genetic blueprint for enhanced human capabilities, everything from accelerated healing and extended lifespan to cognitive abilities that would be considered superhuman by current standards. We're not dealing with genetic modifications that were added to certain bloodlines, Dr. Freeman revealed. We're dealing with genetic capabilities that were removed from everyone else. This discovery turned the entire narrative upside down. The Nephilim bloodlines weren't genetically superior because they possessed something extra. They were superior because they had retained access to original human capabilities that had been systematically suppressed in the general population. Dr. Freeman's analysis revealed that the genetic suppression system works by blocking access to these dormant archives through what he described as genetic encryption protocols. These protocols prevent most humans from accessing their full genetic potential, while allowing certain bloodlines to maintain complete access. But here's where Dr. Freeman's discovery becomes revolutionary. He found that the encryption protocols could be bypassed using specific combinations of electromagnetic frequencies, biochemical triggers, and consciousness activation techniques. The suppression system has a backdoor, Dr. Freeman explained, and once you know how to access it, you can restore full genetic function in any human being. Dr. Freeman's research was immediately classified when government agencies realized the implications of his discovery. If his techniques could be widely distributed, they could trigger mass activation of suppressed genetic capabilities across entire populations. But before his research was seized, Dr. Freeman managed to transmit his activation protocols to a network of researchers around the world. Within months, independent laboratories began confirming his findings and developing their own variations of the genetic activation process. Dr. Lisa Chang, a molecular biologist working in Hong Kong, was among the first to successfully replicate Dr. Freeman's results. Her experiments showed that subjects who underwent the genetic activation process demonstrated immediate improvements in cognitive function, physical strength, and sensory perception. We're talking about capabilities that most people would consider impossible, Dr. Chang reported in Underground Scientific Networks. Enhanced pattern recognition, accelerated learning, even limited telepathic communication between activated individuals. But Dr. Chang also discovered something that Dr. Freeman's preliminary research had missed. The genetic activation process wasn't just individual, it was collective. When multiple individuals in close proximity underwent genetic activation, their enhanced capabilities became amplified through what Dr. Chang described as quantum genetic entanglement. Activated individuals could share cognitive resources, communicate telepathically, and even access each other's memories and knowledge. We're not just talking about individual enhancement, Dr. Chang explained. We're talking about the emergence of a collective consciousness that operates at superhuman levels. This discovery explained why the genetic suppression system had been maintained so rigorously throughout history. The enhanced bloodlines weren't just protecting their individual advantages, they were preventing the emergence of a collective human consciousness that could challenge their control entirely. Dr. Chang's research revealed that when genetic activation reaches a critical threshold in any population, it triggers what she called cascade awakening, where the enhanced consciousness begins to spread exponentially through quantum genetic resonance. Once approximately 10% of a population undergoes genetic activation, the effect becomes self-sustaining and begins to automatically activate dormant capabilities in nearby individuals, Dr. Chang noted. This meant that genetic liberation wouldn't require individual-by-individual activation. It could spread like a contagion of consciousness once it reached the critical threshold. But Dr. Chang also discovered that the genetic suppression system included fail-safe mechanisms designed to prevent exactly this scenario. Her analysis revealed that the suppression protocols could be dramatically enhanced if the control system detected rising activation levels. In extreme cases, the fail-safe mechanisms could trigger what she described as genetic shutdown that would render affected populations completely incapable of independent thought or action. They have a nuclear option, Dr. Chang warned. If they can't maintain control through normal suppression, they can essentially turn people into biological robots. This created a race against time. The genetic activation techniques were spreading through underground networks faster than the control system could suppress them. But if activation levels reached the threshold that triggered emergency protocols, the consequences could be catastrophic for anyone carrying the suppression modifications. Dr. James Rodriguez, a systems analyst who had been tracking the spread of genetic activation techniques, calculated that current activation rates would reach the critical threshold within 18 months. We're approaching the point where they'll have to choose between losing control entirely or implementing the nuclear option, Dr. Rodriguez predicted in a 2023 analysis that was distributed through encrypted channels. According to Dr. Rodriguez's calculations, the genetic control system was facing an existential crisis. The activation techniques were spreading too quickly to be contained through normal suppression methods, but implementing the nuclear option would essentially destroy the human resources that the control system depended on. They need conscious, capable humans to maintain technological civilization, Dr. Rodriguez explained. If they turn everyone into biological robots, they lose the innovation and productivity that supports their power structure. This created a window of opportunity that Dr. Rodriguez believed could be exploited to force a complete collapse of the genetic control system. If we can accelerate activation rates while simultaneously demonstrating the consequences of the nuclear option, we might be able to force them into a position where they have no choice but to abandon genetic suppression entirely, Dr. Rodriguez proposed. Dr. Rodriguez developed what he called consciousness catalysis protocols, designed to rapidly accelerate genetic activation while building protective networks that could resist emergency suppression measures. These protocols combined Dr. Freeman's activation techniques with community organization strategies and electromagnetic shielding technologies to create what Dr. Rodriguez described as liberation zones, where genetic activation could proceed safely. The key is creating protected spaces where people can undergo activation without triggering the emergency protocols, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Once we have enough liberation zones, we can begin coordinating simultaneous activation events that will overwhelm the control system's response capabilities. Dr. Rodriguez's strategy was being implemented in communities around the world when the control system began its counterattack. In late 2023, researchers working on genetic activation began disappearing. Dr. Freeman vanished from his laboratory in Colorado. Dr. Chang's research facility in Hong Kong was destroyed in what authorities called a gas explosion. Underground networks that had been distributing activation protocols were systematically infiltrated and shut down, but the activation process had already spread beyond the control system's ability to contain it completely. Dr. Maria Santos, a neuroscientist working in Brazil, had been documenting cases of spontaneous genetic activation occurring in individuals who had never been exposed to the formal protocols. We're seeing people activating naturally just through exposure to others who have already undergone the process, Dr. Santos reported through encrypted communications. The quantum genetic entanglement effect is creating spontaneous awakening events. Dr. Santos's research revealed that genetic activation was beginning to spread through what she called consciousness contagion. Individuals with activated genetics were unconsciously triggering activation in others through proximity effects that operated below the threshold of detection by suppression systems. The control system is designed to monitor and suppress deliberate activation attempts, Dr. Santos explained, but it can't detect or prevent the natural quantum resonance effects that occur between activated and unactivated individuals. This meant that genetic liberation was becoming unstoppable through conventional suppression methods. The activation process was evolving beyond the control system's ability to monitor or prevent it. But Dr. Santos also documented increasingly desperate attempts by the control system to prevent the spread of natural activation. We're seeing the deployment of new electromagnetic interference technologies designed to disrupt quantum genetic resonance, Dr. Santos reported. They're literally trying to jam the consciousness frequencies that enable natural activation. These electromagnetic interference systems were being deployed through 5G networks and other communication infrastructure, creating what Dr. Santos described as consciousness dead zones, where genetic activation became extremely difficult or impossible. They're turning the technological infrastructure into a weapon against human consciousness, Dr. Santos warned. The same systems people rely on for communication and information are being used to prevent genetic awakening. But Dr. Santos also discovered that the interference systems had unintended consequences. In some cases, the electromagnetic disruption actually accelerated genetic activation by triggering defensive responses in human DNA. The suppression technology is causing evolutionary pressure that's forcing rapid adaptation in human genetic systems, Dr. Santos explained. People are developing natural resistance to electromagnetic interference faster than the control system can adapt. This evolutionary response was creating what Dr. Santos called quantum genetic mutations that made individuals not only resistant to suppression, but capable of functioning at enhanced levels even in high-interference environments. We're witnessing real-time human evolution driven by technological pressure, Dr. Santos noted. The control system's attempts to prevent activation are actually creating superactivated individuals who are immune to their suppression methods. Dr. Santos's research was confirming what quantum geneticists had predicted. The genetic control system was facing a fundamental limitation. Every attempt to enhance suppression created evolutionary pressure that drove the development of resistance mechanisms. They're trapped in an arms race they can't win, Dr. Santos concluded. Each escalation in suppression technology triggers corresponding advances in human resistance capabilities. This created a scenario where the control system would either have to abandon genetic suppression entirely or implement the nuclear option that would destroy the technological civilization they depended on. Dr. Michael Chen, a strategic analyst who had been monitoring the conflict between genetic liberation and suppression systems, believed that the control system was preparing to implement the nuclear option despite the consequences. They're facing an existential threat to their control structure, Dr. Chen explained in a 2024 analysis. From their perspective, destroying technological civilization might be preferable to losing control over human consciousness entirely. According to Dr. Chen's intelligence sources, the control system was developing what they called controlled collapse scenarios, designed to implement genetic shutdown while maintaining enough technological infrastructure to support a drastically reduced population under direct control. They're planning to sacrifice most of humanity to maintain control over a small, manageable population, Dr. Chen warned. The nuclear option isn't just about suppressing consciousness, it's about depopulation. But Dr. Chen also identified factors that could prevent the implementation of controlled collapse scenarios. The genetic activation process has spread further than they realized, Dr. Chen noted. There are now activated individuals within their own organizations who are working to prevent the nuclear option. Dr. Chen's research revealed that genetic activation was occurring even among individuals within the control system hierarchy. These internally activated individuals were beginning to resist orders and sabotage suppression efforts from within. Consciousness awakening doesn't respect organizational boundaries, Dr. Chen explained. Some of their own people are waking up and refusing to participate in genocide. This internal resistance was creating chaos within the control system's command structure. Orders were being ignored, suppression technologies were malfunctioning, and information about activation techniques was being leaked from within classified programs. The system is eating itself, Dr. Chen observed. The same genetic activation process they're trying to suppress is spreading through their own ranks. Dr. Chen's analysis suggested that the control system was rapidly losing the organizational coherence necessary to implement complex suppression operations. They may have missed their window for the nuclear option, Dr. Chen concluded. If genetic activation continues to spread through their own organizations, they'll lose the capability to implement coordinated suppression measures. This created an unprecedented opportunity for complete liberation from genetic control systems that had operated for thousands of years. But it also created the possibility of chaotic collapse as the control system's technological infrastructure failed without coordinated management. Dr. Sarah Williams, a systems engineer who had been studying the integration of genetic activation with technological infrastructure, proposed what she called conscious transition protocols, designed to manage the collapse of genetic control systems while preserving essential technologies. We need to be ready to take over the management of critical infrastructure as the control system collapses, Dr. Williams explained. Genetic activation gives us the cognitive capabilities necessary to run these systems, but we need to organize transition teams before the collapse accelerates. Dr. Williams' research had shown that activated individuals possess the enhanced cognitive abilities necessary to manage complex technological systems without the hierarchical control structures that the suppression system depended on. Activated consciousness naturally organizes into cooperative networks that can handle complexity more effectively than traditional hierarchical systems, Dr. Williams noted. We just need to establish those networks before the old system completely fails. Dr. Williams was coordinating with activated individuals around the world to establish what she called consciousness infrastructure networks that could maintain essential services during the transition period. The collapse of genetic control systems doesn't have to mean the collapse of technological civilization, Dr. Williams emphasized, but it does require conscious preparation and coordination among activated individuals. These preparation efforts were accelerating as evidence mounted that the control system was approaching complete organizational failure. Reports were emerging from multiple sources indicating that genetic activation had reached critical mass in key population centers around the world. The consciousness contagion effect was spreading faster than any suppression technology could contain it. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, who had been documenting activation events, reported that spontaneous genetic awakening was occurring simultaneously across multiple continents. We're seeing coordinated activation events that appear to be triggering each other through quantum resonance effects, Dr. Martinez explained. The collective consciousness is organizing itself automatically. Dr. Martinez's observations suggested that the genetic activation process had evolved beyond individual awakening into something resembling a planetary consciousness shift. We're not just dealing with individual humans gaining enhanced capabilities, Dr. Martinez noted. We're witnessing the emergence of a collective intelligence that operates on a global scale. This collective intelligence was demonstrating capabilities that exceeded anything the control system had anticipated. Activated individuals were spontaneously developing solutions to complex problems, coordinating activities across vast distances without technological communication, and even demonstrating what appeared to be precognitive abilities. The collective consciousness seems to have access to information and capabilities that transcend normal space-time limitations, Dr. Martinez reported. We're entering territory that conventional science can't explain. The emergence of these transcendent capabilities mark the final phase of humanity's liberation from genetic control systems that had constrained our development for millennia. The giants of Mesopotamia had established their dominance by maintaining exclusive access to enhanced genetic capabilities while suppressing the same potential in the general population, but their system contained the seeds of its own destruction. The same genetic modifications that created their advantage also created the potential for mass awakening that could restore enhanced capabilities to all of humanity. That awakening is happening now. The genetic suppression systems that maintained artificial limitations on human consciousness for thousands of years are collapsing under the weight of their own contradictions. The collective human consciousness is emerging from its imposed slumber, and with it comes access to capabilities that will transform not just our understanding of what it means to be human, but our relationship with reality itself. The age of genetic control is ending. The age of conscious evolution is beginning. And every person who awakens to this truth becomes a catalyst for the transformation of human consciousness on a planetary scale. The choice is no longer between genetic servitude and genetic liberation. That battle has already been won. The choice now is whether we'll embrace our enhanced capabilities responsibly, using them to create a civilization based on consciousness rather than control. Because with the collapse of the genetic suppression systems comes the responsibility to rebuild human civilization on foundations that honor the full potential of human consciousness. The giants thought they could control that potential forever. They were wrong. Consciousness cannot be permanently suppressed. It can only be temporarily constrained. And those constraints are dissolving now, revealing the truth that we are all descendants of the same enhanced genetic template that created the Nephilim. The difference is that we're awakening to our true nature not as rulers over others, but as conscious participants in the collective evolution of human potential. The age of giants ruling over diminished humans is over. The age of conscious humanity has begun, and that changes everything.